Meeting. Okay, welcome everyone to the meeting. It is the 27th of August 2019. It is 1:20 in the afternoon and we are gathered in the City Center Conference Room at 351 West Center Street, Provo, Utah. This meeting is being broadcast live on the web on the Provo City Council YouTube channel, where it will also be available for on-demand viewing. Please be aware that the microphones in the room pick up the noise of paper and other rustling objects. Further, be aware that the microphones can pick up side conversations, and we have heard some feedback from the public that sometimes it doesn't pick up the main conversation well enough, so if you are speaking to the group, you'll speak up a little. Although this is a public meeting, only the presenters and those seated at the council table may speak or ask questions unless otherwise invited by the chair. We will begin with a roll call. Mr. Strachan.
Cliff Strachan. Brian Jones.
Dave Connect.
George Handley.
Elizabeth Van Orken.
David Harding.
Kay Van Buren.
Hannah Solzel.
Gary Winterton.
George Stewart.
Mayor Kafusi.
Wayne Parker. Isaac Paxman.
All right, and we are excusing Mr. Sewell, who is away, and would like to invite Mr. Paxman to offer an opening prayer for us.
Father in heaven, we're thankful to be here this day. We're thankful for the citizens of Provo, and we're thankful for those who have chosen to serve as elected officials, as employees, as volunteers. And we ask Thee to bless all these efforts. Bless our city and bless its residents, and bless those who are taking these extra steps to serve. We ask Thee to bless each of them and bless our efforts this day, and do all these things in the name of Thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mr. Paxman. It is proposed that we approve the minutes for the May 7th and July 23rd work meetings, along with the May 7th joint meeting with Parks and Rec Board, and the May 28th meeting with the joint meeting with the Metropolitan Water Board. Are there any requested changes to these minutes? Are there any objections to their approval? Seeing none, I'll declare them approved by unanimous consent. And note here that Mr. Strachan has a couple items of council business.
I do. Councilor Harding, I understand you had a birthday. So, Bryce, would you lead us in a birthday song? Of course, I love you. Oh, somebody's had a birthday, our esteemed council chair. May Father in heaven bless him in all the coming years.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear David. Happy birthday to you.
All right. Well, happy birthday, David.
Thanks, everyone.
I'd like to have Karen join me up here at the podium for a minute. So Karen, as all you know, is our very talented community coordinator and social media guru, et cetera, et cetera. Karen has now been with the city for 5 years. And so we have just a little certificate for Karen. And, a blanket.
Awesome.
Provo blanket. So congratulations for 5 years.
I'm glad I dressed up with my
We really appreciate all you do.
I'll try for at least 5 more. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, item number 1 is a presentation on policy updates from the Utah League of Cities and Towns. We are glad to welcome Mr. Cameron Deal, the Executive Director of the League. Please come up, and we have 25 minutes budgeted for this. Though you might have burned a few with your interviews downstairs, so.
Which is fine, Mr. Chair. If you want me to just say hello and goodbye, I'm happy to do that too.
Thank you for the opportunity to join the Provo City Council today, and thank you for your accommodation of starting the meeting a few minutes late so we could finish our tribute video to your retiring colleagues. I pointed out to them that they have 36 years of institutional memory leading the city of Provo, and I'm 37 years old. So they essentially have my lifetime of experience leading this great city. Speaking of being a great city, it's also a great week in this great city. And I was here, as was pointed out, I was here during rivalry week in previous years, and then I was here last year when the HVAC wasn't working. And I don't think those two are related, but nevertheless, I am wearing a jacket today, but my wife sent me with her shirt that she gave me.
But have you ever worn it?
The only time I've worn it was when she and I were dating. She's a BYU fan, and so in an effort to try to impress her, I wore it, and we went to the game together, and BYU beat Boise State. And I think we can all agree that we always want to beat Boise State. I am wearing my Utah socks, though, just for good measure. With that, Mr. Chair, I also appreciate the opportunity to represent Provo and the other 247 cities in the state. It has been a frantic and extremely busy summer because of a lot of policy issues that the state is considering. Right now, tax reform has sucked the oxygen out of the room, yet there are a lot of other policy issues related to population growth, ranging from water quality to economic development, housing policy, land use, and the like. So, Mr. Chair, I am prepared to speak on really any of those topics, and I was asked to be prepared on all of those, but I want to open it back to you and to your colleagues. What specific issues do you want to discuss? Let's start there, and then we can proceed. Do you want to go to tax reform, or economic development, or water, or which issue is of most importance to start?
So I'll ask my colleagues, but unless they have strong feelings, I would just go with what you feel is the most important, and give us that. But
Your city is one of the leaders when it comes to water rights and water expertise, not just within the league, but statewide. In fact, we have a discussion about the extraterritorial water jurisdiction and the ability for cities to use surplus water contracts to provide water outside of their boundaries, and some of these legal rights that cities possess. Provo, Ogden, Salt Lake, those are the big fish with those water rights and providing having extraterritorial jurisdiction to protect watershed. But what we found within our internal league research is that there are actually dozens of cities around the state that exercise that extraterritorial jurisdiction, and that there are quite a few cities around the state that provide surplus water to residents outside of the jurisdiction. That information was really critical in the policy making, because it went from being a debate that was solely focused on Salt Lake City or Provo City or the old established cities to a bigger conversation about the services that cities provide, ranging in size from Panguitch, which provides water outside of its jurisdiction, to the city of Cedar Hills, which exercises extraterritorial water jurisdiction of American Fork Canyon to protect the watershed. So it was no longer just about Provo City, but all of those other cities helped that overall narrative, which then helped protect Provo's water rights during this last legislative session. So, Councilmember Winterton, we are not anticipating future legislation on that front. Dave Decker's been very supportive and very, very active in the Executive Water Task Force. It's got a new name, but he's been an active participant there. There will always be rumblings. We know there are legislators who don't like what happened last year. In fact, we had a legislator tell us last week on interim day that he wanted to revisit it and open a bill file and go in a different direction. At this point, we don't see any momentum around that, but there could still be a bill file that comes in 2020. But we're very conscientious of Provo's concerns about your water rights and being able to provide water both today and to the needs of the city in the future. And that's not unique to Provo. That's a big deal for many cities. should also mention Mayor Kafusi is on our board of directors, which is in part why I'm cheering for the Kafusi family to have a great day on Thursday night,
Yeah, the
with
real
one notable
question,
exception.
yeah, I was gonna say, the real matter at hand is what is your prediction for the game? Everyone that knows Cameron knows he's a diehard Ute fan, he drives me crazy, but we do have a mutual respect. He cheers for my boys, I cheer for his Utes when they're not playing my boys.
I remember when the Kafusis were a Utah family.
Yeah, for 10 years.
Henry Kafusi and Jeff Kafusi played there, and when your husband was a coach there.
Yeah.
That was my childhood. But I do think Utah wins the game. I think it'll be another nail biter. I think we win 24-17. But I know this meeting's being recorded, and so I fully anticipate being hauled here after BYU wins.
Jump in, what do you think should be on our radar?
Tax reform, tax reform, tax reform. Everything else is going to trickle out of tax reform. So let me take a quick moment just to put all the pieces on the table of where they are at. Several of you I know attended the tax task force open house at UVU a few weeks ago. After the legislature tried and failed to expand the sales tax base and lower the rate during the 2019 legislative session, they went on the road for a series of listening meetings in 8 cities around the state. What was fascinating about these meetings is that they didn't put any proposals on the table. Instead, they said, we want to hear from the general public about your concerns around tax reform. They met in 8 places around the state. In Utah County, it was at UVU. Then they've now had one meeting. They had a meeting last week and another meeting scheduled for next week. And they're now doing deep dives into each section of the state tax code. These meetings are not public hearings, they're public meetings, but there is no public comment. So we, as a league, as well as all of the other lobbyists and interest groups, are just sitting there listening for 3 hours as they debate amongst themselves what to do. The meeting they had last week focused primarily on sales tax on food and potential changes to the income tax. And then there were some other minor things that they looked at, but really a lot of focus was on sales tax on food and other ways to expand the sales tax base. They started into sales tax exemptions, and I think they're going to keep going down that path. As a reminder, back in 2006, the legislature repealed part of the state sales tax on food. And they also made it so that most local governments could not tax food. A key exception is that Provo City and all other cities can still impose the full 1% on food. However, the county options for transportation, or the Provo wrap tax or other boutique taxes, do not apply to food. If the legislature were to decide to put food fully back in the sales tax base, we anticipate that for the state that would be a 10 to 12% increase in revenue if the rate stayed constant. That would mean for, say, a wrap tax or for the county options for transportation, you would see an increase if the rate stayed the same of about 10 to 12%. That would not be the case for the local 1% because food is already taxed at the full 1% rate and sales tax, or under the local 1%. On the income tax side, local governments do not get any income tax dollars. We don't impose it, we don't receive it. However, all that money goes to education, and Utah's the only state in the country that has the income tax siloed for one purpose. That has caused a lot of consternation within our colleagues at the school districts and school boards association, because all that money is a protection for local public education to have that earmark around the income tax. If something were to change with that earmark, it would need the vote of the people because it would need a constitutional amendment. Whether or not the people would vote to support a change in the income tax is still up in the air. Y2 Analytics just released a poll last week where they showed only 30% of Utahns supported making changes to that constitutional earmark. Let's just hypothesize that the state does decide that's what they want to do. They want to free up some money in that earmark. What is the trickle down or the ripple effect on local governments, particularly on cities like Provo? If the legislature goes down the path of changing the income tax, they could expand the sales tax, which would have a ripple effect on us if they expand the sales tax base beyond just food or put exemptions back into the base. You would see an increase within your 1%. They could go to local school districts and say, we want you to raise property tax to offset what the state is withholding or changing within the constitutional earmark. Whether or not local school districts would raise property taxes is up in the air. There has been discussion about including a CPI adjustment or some sort of adjustment in the truth in taxation process, which would allow local school districts to collect a little more in property tax. If that were to be the case for school districts, we would want that to be the case for cities as well, and counties have indicated the same thing. So there could be a ripple effect to cities on that property tax piece. There's also ongoing discussion about the motor fuel tax. Several years ago, back in 2015, the state changed the motor fuel tax, made it more of a percentage base. It's still not keeping pace with the transportation needs. Cities and counties get 30% of the motor fuel tax, and within that 30%, cities get approximately 64% of that. So anything they do on the motor fuel tax, if they were to increase it, we would see under the current formula about 30%. However, there's been some discussion at the legislature over whether the state should try to bifurcate the gas tax and just have gas tax be state rather than local. That leads to an interesting conversation that initiated here in Provo, and that's the transportation utility fee. As you know, Pleasant Grove imposed a transportation utility fee, and it's in the courts right now, and it's being litigated. We've had multiple legislators, both those who are supportive of the utility fee and who are opposed to the utility fee, who said they want to run legislation to better clarify how that fee operates. We've told them that it doesn't make any sense to run legislation until after we see how the litigation comes out. At some point, Provo and the league and the other cities that have imposed the utility fee will need to have that conversation about where do we go from here and how does that fit into these larger conversations about tax reform. So I'll stop there, Mr. Chair, see if there are any questions if you want to bring up, because we could go all day just on tax reform alone.
Let me just, one thought on that last one. I know you represent all cities, but you also act as a little bit of a liaison to maybe help us get together and kind of find a consensus so we can have a united front. I think for us, part of that discussion about is it legal and what kind of legislation, and I think, at least from our perspective, we might want to have a conversation about when, if the utility fee, transportation utility fee is not appropriate in all circumstances, might it be appropriate in some circumstances? And perhaps that might be a middle ground where we say cities that meet these conditions are allowed to do it. I wonder if that's a middle ground that we might be able to, it's like resort cities are treated differently, because they have a different situation. So I think, at least Provo, I think we would be interested in, depending on how things go and how things play out, maybe having that kind of conversation.
The whole reason it started is because Provo is a very unique city. The other cities that have looked into the utility fee have looked into it in part because of some unique characteristics, but I think the bigger reason they've looked into it is because you're the first city to really try to capture the user fee component of people who use the roads. What's interesting about this overall conversation is while Provo has led out on that concept, the legislature just last year authorized a pilot program at UDOT for a road user charge. Utah will be the second state in the country with this pilot program. Nevada just passed it, they'll be the third. And the league has been involved in helping work this out. UDOT will actually be presenting about this at our conference next month, and it goes live January 1st. The whole idea of this road user charge is to better correlate and connect the user of the transportation system and the impact that your vehicle has on the roads with the fee that you're paying, as opposed to right now, if you drive an alternative fuel vehicle, you're using the roads and you're not paying direct gas tax. So the pilot program is actually targeted at alternative fuel vehicles. I bring that up because the state wants to go to this user fee model. Provo has led out at trying to do a user fee model. There may be room within that overall conversation about user fees to combine the two or chart a new path forward on it.
Mr. Track.
Towing's back on the agenda.
Towing, yes.
And then the other one I think would be interested to hear about is last year there was a lot of effort to try and help with police and fire retirements, et cetera, et cetera. You seen more action on those fronts this year?
Yes and yes. On the towing front, I want to thank Brian Jones, who was one of the league's representatives in addition to Provo on the towing advisory board. May it rest in peace, right, Brian? The legislature dissolved it last legislative session, so you're welcome for getting your summer back. But The bill sponsor from the last 3 sessions brought back another version of his bill for legislative interims last week. And I emailed some of you about it last week when the bill came out the night before it was in committee. And this time the bill is focused just on signage, and I think it's a noble effort on the part of the legislator to try to improve the signage requirements in the law. The result of his bill as currently drafted would radically change how signage is regulated and how property owners have to put up signs on their property. So we convinced the legislator and the Transportation Interim Committee to hold the bill last week and not endorse it as a committee bill, so you can actually get stakeholders together to talk about these signage concerns. Provo City is the epicenter for towing issues, part of you being a unique city that I referenced earlier. So we will make sure, from the league perspective, that Provo is in the room having those conversations with this legislature. The key point, though, is that there are other cities, Ogden, West Valley, Salt Lake, and others, who are very concerned about towing. That's why we as a league have been so strongly opposed to some of the state preemptive efforts over the last few years. But stay tuned, this one just never goes away. On the public safety side, the legislature passed SB 129 last year that really was an unfunded mandate on the backs of public safety officers as well as public safety agencies. For those of you who were involved with the LPC, and Mayor and Wayne and Isaac are constant companions of ours at the Capitol, we were trying to push back on the state and say if the state is going to mandate an expansion of compensation benefits, in this case retirement, then the state should be willing to pay into it. Ultimately, that's not what happened. The state expanded the benefit for both state and locals, and were unwilling to fund the local piece of it. The concession they gave us was a delayed effective date, so it was now part of your budget this year, will be in your budget next year. What we were told at the time was this will be a one-time thing. That is not going to be the case. We've already heard from legislators that they want to expand the benefit to what I'm calling Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 2 plus. Right now, under SB 129, if Provo City hires an officer in July of 2020 or beyond, you have to pay into the system enough for them to qualify for the 50% retirement like a Tier 1 employee. So that's the Tier 2 plus. But if Provo City hired a public safety officer between 2011 and 2020, they're still at the 37.5% retirement. So the legislature wants to figure out how to bridge that gap and bring all of those officers that are currently in Tier 2 into Tier 2 plus. At this point, they do not have a funding stream in mind. They just want to put that on the backs of local government. What we plan to unveil at the conference in a couple of weeks is we're going to work with the City Management Association to put together a working group to try to identify potential revenue sources, state or otherwise. Well, I guess the first point is we need to decide where we want to be on this Tier 2, Tier 2 plus. Do we want to oppose it like we did last year and then see where things go? Or do we want to try to be more proactive and identify potential revenue streams? So those are the questions we need to answer as an organization this fall, and we plan to work closely with the City Management Association to answer those questions.
Okay. We hit 20 minutes, so let's see if we can wrap up here. I think I mentioned to you briefly at another time, 8 years ago or so, we were redistricting as a city, and this was long before I even thought I'd ever be on the council. But the way that precincts are drawn and then the way that districts are drawn, they're under very different rules, and so it makes it really difficult to create to have the ability to create districts to kind of represent different demographics and areas of the city. There's just some significant difficulties there. I thought, wow, it'd be nice, we need to fix this system. Well, now, 8 years later, it's probably we're running out of time to make some changes. I'd love to kind of sit down sometime and explain what are some problems and some potential solutions, and see if I imagine every jurisdiction in Utah faces these challenges, so perhaps we can make some improvements before we get into redistricting the next round.
If memory serves, I believe there are 15 cities that have districts like Provo. So either they're all districts or they're the hybrid like Provo with councils and at large. During the discussion last year on House Bill 119, which was the local referendum bill, we were trying to simplify the ability for Provo City, and really any city, to have precincts and districts better aligned. On that referendum bill, the way that applies in Provo City is you already have districts, so you don't have to draw voter participation areas, but your neighbors everywhere else in the county do. So what we wanted was coordination between the county clerk and the city clerk, who's responsible for drawing the voter participation areas for the Orms of the world, and the clerk in Provo drawing the districts for your redistricting purposes, and make sure we've got better alignment so that those voter participation areas are constitutional. So I think that bill created the framework for this discussion. What my request is to your team here in Provo is let us know if it doesn't go far enough, because there will be cleanups to that bill, and let's try to get this done before the 2020 census and 2021 redistricting. The county clerks, for the first time, really engaged with us on the referendum bill, and as you know, the relationship between certain county clerks and certain cities has not always been rosy, but we had a very good working relationship with multiple county clerks on House Bill 119. So I think the door is open at the LG's office and the county clerks to address this concern for 2021.
Okay, thank you. Any other quick questions before we end this? Thank you very much, Mr. Deal. We appreciate your expertise and how long you represent us and all the work you do behind the scenes. We really appreciate your efforts.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your participation in the league, and really thank you for the service you rendered. It really was a privilege for me to spend some time with the 4 retiring council members and learn from them during that period of time. So thank you for the service that you rendered to Provo City and to the state.
Thank you. Item number 2 is a discussion regarding sewer capacity west of I-15 and a consideration of options. This will be presented by Mr. Decker.
Yeah, let me start, Mr. Chairman, if that's okay.
Thank you.
As you know, as we've been working through our improved development review process, I've had the opportunity to sit in our CRC meetings for the last several months, and it's been very enlightening and eye-opening for me to get into the weeds on a number of the development-related issues in Provo. One of those, as you know, that's been particularly troubling has been dealing with balancing the pressures of growth on the west side with sewer capacity, which tends to inhibit growth on the west side, and the various competing interests that many of you dealt with as we went through the general plan process for particularly the southwest area plan that we recently did. Again, trying to balance the interests of many competing parties. So that the further we've gone, as we've seen development applications come through, and we've modeled some of those proposals and their impact on the wastewater collection system, it's been clear that we're not very well aligned. And we find ourselves in a circumstance where we have sort of two real, couple of key policy considerations, I guess. So as we went through the process of the Southwest Area Plan, we identified some areas where we would have lower density development, 4 units to the acre on average, and some that would be more dense than that. And yet, the land uses haven't really aligned well with our wastewater capacity. Some of the areas we've targeted, for example, for townhomes or higher density development, have the least amount of sewer capacity available to us. Now, we don't want sewer capacity to drive development patterns. It should be just the other way around. But we're confronting a challenge now in terms of timing. As we came to you in the last 5-year CIP process and talked about development on the west side, we laid out a 5 to 7 year plan to really grapple with sewer capacity. The challenge is that it's a lot more granular than the broad brush we've kind of taken so far. So we recognize that those issues are not particularly in alignment. The other one is, for what limited sewer capacity we have available, how does that get allocated? And we haven't really at all had that policy discussion. So for example, is it properties that have already been zoned, platted, and have a development agreement? Should those come first? What if those have been zoned and platted and have sat undeveloped for 10 years, and we have some of those. Should those groups get priority even though they're not ready to be developed versus those that are ready to be developed and that maybe got zoned and platted later, have been zoned and not platted, or haven't been zoned at all, still remain in agricultural zoning. And those are, that prioritization of the remaining sewer capacity has become a pretty difficult issue. And so again, what we hope to do today as we talked with council leadership about kind of how to tackle these two really key issues, the suggestion was that we do a two-part discussion, that in today's work session we spend time talking about the capacity issues predominantly and where they are and what our challenges are, what we think might be available based on a variety of CIP strategies. Dave and his team will get into that in some more detail. We also want to hit today a little bit on this prioritization question and talk about ways we've seen it done in other places. In 2 weeks, on the 10th of September, we have invited a couple of our larger developers on the west side who have interest in subdivisions at various stages. Some that have been developed, planned, platted, and we're in the third or fourth stage of development of those subdivisions. Others that have completed some developments but also have other potential developments in the pipeline. And what we wanted you to do is get the perspective not just from city staff and the engineers and the technicians, but also get a perspective from the development community as to what they're feeling in terms of development opportunities on the area west, predominantly the area west of the freeway. And then to talk about what they've confronted as they've dealt with other cities who've been in similar circumstances over the years. And to talk about strategies that we may not have considered along the way, or that we may have considered and rejected. And then our hope is that at the end of the next work meeting, that we would have a discussion with the council about, are there any different scenarios that you'd like us to model for you? So could we look at some of these other potential financing tools and figure out, is there a way to, if you want to accelerate wastewater development on the west side, are there ways to do that? If you don't want to accelerate wastewater capacity increases on the west side, it's good to know that too. And so the idea was, rather than having this discussion evolve in every application to an engineer-to-engineer discussion when we don't really have a clear policy statement about what we'd like to see on the west side, we'd like to have the policy level discussion with you. And so that's kind of been our strategy as we worked with council leadership and staff on this. And so today is sort of step one of 2 or 3 steps in the process to again help us kind of chart the course for the future. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to turn the time, if you're okay, over to Dave Decker to walk through what I think will be a very interesting presentation to you that will set the stage then for a discussion in 2 weeks with the development community. So any questions you have for me before we move to Mr. Decker? Okay, thank you very much. Dave.
Thank you, Mr. Parker, and thank you to the council, to Chair Harding for the time to talk again about wastewater. It's been about 6 months, March of this year, since we covered any wastewater topics. And I was asked today to give a very quick history about what has happened in wastewater over the last 6 or 7 years, and talk about where we're at from a capacity standpoint and options moving forward. And I'm going to try to cover 6 years of history in about 30 minutes or less. So I'm just going to be touching the very specific topics, the most important topics. Certainly not an in-depth conversation about any of these topics. If there are questions, I'd be happy to answer any of the questions that you might have, and just stop me in the middle of the presentation. So just very quickly, I wanted to mention the very first thing that I became aware of was this plan right here. It was put on my desk just a short time after I started with the city in July of 2012. And this is a collection system master plan in wastewater. It was adopted in April of 2013 by the council. One of the things that we identified very quickly in the master plan, the collections master plan, was that it did not include any specific look at the treatment plant. It was mostly just in the pipe system, the collection system. So we initiated in 2014 a master plan specific to the treatment plant. That moved forward through a couple of years. In 2016, we had Walt Baker, who's the former director of DEQ, come and do a specific presentation to the council. He had actually come before I started, I think it was in 2009 or 2010, and completed a presentation. And it was mostly discussing the future regulations that DEQ had planned for waters throughout the state of Utah. It was probably a more specific conversation about Utah Lake, specifically phosphorus and nitrogen in the discharge from the treatment plants in Utah Lake. We had another presentation in October of 17, and then also another presentation in March of 18. In 17, the latter part of 17, we submitted a variance request on those regulations. So many years ago, several years ago, before, I think it was in 2006, I think, they had started talking in 2002 about these first steps of regulations. They were put into place, and a variance was allowed by cities, which if cities were going to make significant upgrades to their treatment plant, you could submit a variance letter and actually get another 5 years until 2025 to meet those regulations. So there was a deadline for that, January 1st of 18. We submitted in October that variance letter, along with a large amount of documentation that was required, mostly from the treatment plant master plan that I mentioned earlier. Eventually, the state DEQ granted that variance, which extended our obligation to meet those regulations until 2025. However, we had to make several commitments along with that the variance letter. In March of 18, some specific conversations were started with the state relative to funding options, and later in that year, the council asked us to go to the state and talk about using a revolving loan that Erica Gaddis had mentioned during her presentation. Also in 2016, we started in-house hydraulic modeling of our wastewater system. That was one of the things that had not been done previously, and we felt like that was an important step to be able to answer questions about capacity issues. We completed a metering study in the spring of 18. This is a specific plan that moved forward with 30, I think it was 32 or 33 meters in a variety of different locations throughout the city. It was actually to look at the flow in the pipes and verify the assumptions that were made in master plans. In 2019, we are doing ongoing metering throughout the city. We have 5 sewer meters that we've purchased and continue to use those meters to verify flows. There's a number of other studies that are not listed on this page, but I'm not going to go into the detail just because of the time. And again, I'd be happy to spend some more time if there are some questions on it. This is just a map that shows the location of the meters that were done in the spring of 18. Primarily looking at flows and specifically rainfall data. We were after information relative to what we call I&I, it's inflow and infiltration, where it's not sewer water, but it's groundwater, either coming from the river, from snow and rainfall events that's essentially leaking into the pipes. Provo City has had an I&I problem. It went back into the early master plans for the wastewater, and I&I is mentioned as a problem in the 50s and the 60s in their sewer. So this has been a long-standing problem for Provo. One of the things, the reason that we talk about I&I is that you have developers come and talk to you, and this may be mentioned in the 10th of September presentation from the developers. They may mention that Provo utilizes a flow that's higher than most cities, and if you look at I&I, that is a correct statement. Provo City actually uses, on the actual flow from residential and commercial buildings, we use a slightly lower flow because we verified it with the meter studies. that's recommended from the state. We actually use a slightly lower flow from what the state recommends. But if you combine that with the I&I influence that comes from groundwater, that's where we do use a flow that's higher. And again, we verified the I&I problem in a number of studies. So we feel confident in the flows that we're utilizing in both master plans and the hydraulic modeling.
How confident are you in your study? This was the second wettest year we've ever had. How did that wetness affect your study? Did you have any concerns about that?
So the 5 meters that we had in this year largely verified the base flows. In areas that we are working to correct the I&I problem, and you'll actually see one of the corrections here in just a minute, we're getting some pretty good results. We're not to the point where we're going to say, hey, we've corrected that problem. We know it's not going to reoccur. But we're getting pretty good results in areas where we're going in and lining pipes or doing specific corrections in the joints in the joints of the pipes. So we're feeling like we're getting a handle on it. Now I do have to mention one of the concerns that I have just overall in public works, just because we correct the problem in the sewer pipe, that water that's coming in from the outside doesn't disappear. It's going somewhere, and there's potential concern. Does it go into homes? Does it go downstream and filter into the sewer system someplace else? Is it getting pumped through sump pumps in a basement of a home back into the sewer? That's one of the specific concerns that I have is if they're particularly on the west side, we know that there are homes that have sump pumps in their ground floor. And if we're keeping it out of the sewer system, but they turn around and pump it through a sump pump, and it goes back into a floor drain, right back into the sewer, and we really corrected the problem, we haven't. It's still going to be groundwater in the sewer. Please.
Just clarification, some pumps into sewer is not legal, correct? But sometimes it happens. Okay, thank you.
So as far as I&I, this is one of the studies that we looked at. These are flows. We've mentioned this before, and I'm not going to get into the details of this chart, but this is flow that goes back to 2004 at the treatment plant, showing the flow rates at the treatment plant, different time periods. This is one of the studies that we utilize to justify I&I. We've talked about the different periods where we had very high I&I influence. 2011, this is one of the justifications of using a high flow rate or higher flow rate. What we call a background flow, actually. It's probably better stated as a background flow in the hydraulic modeling. And so right now our modeling is based on a 2011 I&I problem with the flows that are coming, as I mentioned, from the state levels. So I don't know if we can run this video. Jimmy, do you know if this video works?
No, we have the video file.
It doesn't look like it.
We'll bring it up.
And we'll see if we can get this to go. And while they're working on that, I failed to mention this presentation amongst every presentation that I made. This is a huge team effort. We've got a number of people here that we've introduced before, and they just do a fantastic job for Public Works. So this is a video that you have not seen before, but I thought as we talked about I&I, this is a really good example. I think this comes from Chris Wright, and Chris Wright is our collections manager in wastewater. And they, as they TV and maintain the lines, I asked them to keep track of some videos that would kind of illustrate what we've got as far as I&I. So as soon as you can run that, go ahead and start it. It's only. So this is a joint in a pipe. It's up by University Parkway, and you can tell the water's under pressure coming through that joint. That's not just a trickle. That's a pretty healthy leak in a joint. And in the cases where we find this, particularly in this line, we were finding multiple joints that had that exact same problem. Lots and lots of water coming through that. And that's not, a sewer system, it's important to understand, a sewer system is not designed for water from the outside. It's supposed to be just wastewater. So that's groundwater coming in, under influence from either a storm, but likely in this case it's groundwater from either irrigation or the river. So that particular pipe that I just showed you, this is the result after the fact, and we actually have a video of it, but this pipe was lined after we went in and corrected most of the joint issues. We went in and lined the actual pipe, and so this is the resulting the end result as we move up it. And you can see none of the joints are leaking anymore in it. But this is an effort that takes money, it takes time to get this done, and we have this issue in many parts of the city have this problem.
David, can you do that then without digging? You just set something down the pipe?
Yep, it's all done from the manhole, from manhole to manhole, so there's no digging in the road.
Wow.
And it's not cheap. It's almost as expensive as replacing the pipe in the ground. You could almost dig up the road and replace the pipe.
But if you can do it without digging up the road,
It's a lot more convenient. Yep. And I said it's almost as expensive. It's not quite, but
So the flip side of that's true too, right? If you have infiltration like you are, it means when you don't have water coming in, that sewage in the pipe is then infiltrating out down below, isn't it?
not necessarily. It depends on what's happening on the outside of the pipe. So if the pipe is surrounded by water, by groundwater, and particularly in this case where it's pressurized, you can tell there's a lot of pressure pushing in. The likelihood of water escaping from a pipe that's at atmosphere, it's not. There's no pressure in that pipe.
You're not worried about contamination below that.
It's much less of an issue. Where you got water coming in, you probably don't have water escaping. But it can be an issue. That's not to say, hey, that doesn't happen anywhere in the city. So we're going to keep going here. So the next slide, this is a result of the hydraulic modeling that I mentioned, and the pipes that are highlighted are the major lines. We'll come back and visit this for just a second, but you can see the color coding on the legend. As the colors get darker, we get more and more concerned about capacity issues, and you can see some of those purple and even the darker colors start to show up as an issue for capacity, particularly on the west side, but it's not unique to the west side by any means. And we'll come back and talk about that in just a second. So all these studies, and particularly the metering study that was done in 2018, eventually generated a map, and we started sharing this map in the latter part of 2018. It was eventually finalized in the spring of 19. This memo and this map was given to the council, and basically we color-coded the entire part of the city, and areas that are shown in red really have no capacity, and for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it was just simply they didn't have a pipe. There's not even a system available in some cases, but even in some cases where there is a pipe system, there is a capacity issue associated with it. The yellow areas are areas where they have a less severe, we call it a minor issue as far as capacity. But in some cases, we're still saying to those developers, even in the yellow areas, you can't develop. We just don't have the capacity in that particular area. So basically, this generated a policy for public works to really model using our hydraulic modeling. We model every single development that comes in and determine the capacity, the impact of the capacity in the sewer system. We'll come back and talk about that map in just a second also. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit to the water reclamation plant. So the specifics, so we talked a lot about the pipe system, but the treatment plant itself, I mentioned the history and the regulations already. I'm going to skip down to the master plan that was started in 2014. The variance letter I also mentioned. We mentioned also approaching the state DEQ board for the loan. They eventually approved that loan request for about $78 million. In the middle of that, we were participating with two cities south of us, Springville and Spanish Fork, in a regional siting study. The state actually asked us to participate in this. We had initially looked at it when we did our own siting study for the treatment plant. That's actually not mentioned in any of this list, but we did a siting study We looked at regional, they looked again at the regional setting and came back and recommended, indicated that there was no benefit to Provo for any regional construction of a treatment plant. The last decisions that I want to make the last decision that I want to report on the treatment plant mostly come in 2019. We hired in January, December and January of this year, we hired Waterworks in Arcadis, a design group to start the actual treatment plant design. Just recently, we have also brought in a contractor, Archer Western. I could remember the Western. Archer Western. They are the CMGC, so they're the contract part of the design team, the construction part of the design team, so they will be participating with the design team. We have a project manager on board, Hanson Allen Luce, and AECOM is also doing the project management for us. Upcoming issues that the council needs to be aware of in October, late October, early November of this year, we will be going back to the DEQ board for the last of 3 requirements in that variance letter. So we have to do a capital facilities plan presentation to the DEQ board, and they will give us an authorization for the loan that I mentioned. It will require a council resolution, and again, sometime in October, November, you will see that. Construction schedule for the treatment plant itself, we've broken it into a couple of packages right now at this point. In January of 2020, we anticipate package 1 will start. A lot of it is groundwork, but there is quite a bit of electrical work planned also. Package 2 is probably more of the actual visible construction that you'll see, and that will start in the fall of 2020. And construction is anticipated to be completed in December of 22. Partly, there may be a question about why we push construction so quickly. We have a variance letter that goes out until 2025. Why are we pushing construction so hard? Part of that is not wanting to put more investment into the treatment plant particularly for facilities that are going to be taken out with the new treatment plant. We don't want to invest more money and then just rip it out a few years later. So feeling like we needed to move along on the treatment plant as quickly as possible, that generated the construction schedule. Here's some of the latest drawings from the design team. This is a rendering, and then I think we have a plan view following this. This is at full build out right now. We only have 3 trains, what we call trains, planned at the treatment plant. You can see in the background, these are existing facilities at the treatment plant. This is the operations building, the entrance off of the road is right there to the west, just barely off this picture. And so you can kind of picture where this is being built. The trickling filters that we've mentioned a couple of times to the council are underneath those 2 new clarifiers that are right there. So we'll build, as I mentioned, we'll build 3 trains right here, about 5 million gallons per day capacity in each of those trains. So once the 3 trains are completed, we'll have about 15 MGD, million gallons per day capacity at the treatment plant. Additional trains are planned sometime in the future, probably somewhere in the range of 2030 to 2035. We'll have another phase of construction, and also with the solid portion of the treatment plant. So back here on the north end of the treatment plant, we have digesters, and we call that kind of the solids processing part of the treatment plant. That will continue to operate during the first phase, but that will largely be rebuilt during the 2030-35 construction of the plant right now. I'll talk a little bit about the backbone in just a second that is planned to be constructed, and we're underway right now. But one of the concerns that I have, and one of the things that the council needs to understand as development starts to come and do, whether it's presentations or you talk to council members, to developers, you're going to have developers that want to develop in areas even after the backbone, what we call the backbone of the west side sewer is done. they are not necessarily going to have direct access to a sewer line. They're going to have a backbone, but there's ribs that come into a backbone just like the human body. And this is one of those ribs right there that we've identified in the master planning process with Horrocks Engineering, who laid out this map. But right now, we do not finance, we do not have that in the plan for construction. And there's probably several other pipes that will come in and connect to that backbone infrastructure. So as we go through this presentation, it's important to realize that some of the necessary pipes for development are not in the financial plan. Please.
So you talked about backbone and ribs. You pointed to that down on Lakeview Parkway.
Yep.
Is that a rib or is that is that the backbone?
That's a rib, and I'll show you the backbone. It's a little bit different. It's a little toward the end of the presentation.
Okay.
It shows the backbone in a little bit better manner of how we're going to construct that. So I think it's also important, and I know this is a little bit of a shifting gear for this topic, but as I talked with Wayne and Mayor Kafusi about this presentation, one of the concerns that I often see with development is it's whether it's city staff or the development community, we oftentimes focus on one particular problem. We'll do development review and it'll have 10 things on the list and they'll pick out one of them. We spend a lot of time focused on that, trying to solve that one particular item. But I get concerned that we think that as soon as we solve the sewer problem on the west side, the development's ready to go, and that's not necessarily the case. There's still other infrastructure that needs to be done besides just the sewer. So we've listed a few of those things on this page, just a couple of details about what's missing. So this is a page out of the Stormwater Master Plan that the council approved. Brian, when did this happen? In December last year? Yep. December of 2018. And this is just highlighting the west side. Sizes are shown here. You can see cost estimates have been, well, you can't really see this. These are cost estimates that have been developed by our stormwater staff. And I think, Jimmy, do we have a close-up version of this? Nope. So Hannah's going to help us here for just a second. We're going to get a better view of that spreadsheet so that we can see some of the costs. But just very quickly, this is about a 10-year plan, so we're going out to 2032 on this particular plan. This is very similar to what we've done on the wastewater. Some of the totals at the bottom, you can see we're spending somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.5 million per year, per fiscal year, to get the projects completed. And you can see some of those stormwater. I'll just pick one of them. Hannah, if you go to the far left side, and you pan up just a tad. So Geneva Road is one that I picked out. It's on the west side. And if you pan over to the right, you can see we don't even fund that until right there, until 2030, 2031 right now under the current finance plan.
What is that line?
So that's a new stormwater line that comes down Geneva Road on the west side. So I'm just telling you, and I'm not saying, hey, we're stuck in this timeline. I'm just saying that we've got more issues than just wastewater on the west side.
Dave, does some of that timing change then if MAG funding comes in place for the 820 North or for a new interchange or anything like that?
So for roads, that potentially is an influence, yes. Yep. So Hannah, let's go back to the presentation if that's okay. So just really quickly, we're going to skip past that. This is a very, very rough water master plan that Gary Calder developed with his staff, and just used mostly for presentation purposes. But as you know, I think it was in 2015, we completed 2 water tanks that service primarily the west side of Provo. The water boundary actually is the set of railroad tracks that cut through the city. So everything west of those railroad tracks is in the new water zone, utilizing the 2 new water tanks, one up on Columbia Lane and one up in Slate Canyon. Those associated with those tanks, we brought a water line is it a 30 or 36-inch water line? 30? 30-inch down to about the cemetery, and then also through Grandview, we brought, I think, a 36 down through Grandview down to almost Geneva Road, just east of I-15. And those water lines will need to be extended into the west side. And you can see what we're trying to extend, how we're trying to extend those water lines, sizes of the lines, and approximate costs at this point, estimates. So I'm going to shift gears again, going back as far as just a little bit of history. I think it's important to understand. It helps to know a little bit about why we're going financially where we're going right now, is to kind of look back in the history of wastewater. So you can see on this particular chart, Jimmy's prepared going back to 2004. And we can go back further if the council's interested. We've shown this before. But you can see the revenue that was generated in the wastewater, how much of that was actually spent on CIP projects. And the point that I make with this is, you know, for me as a professional spending lots of time in public works, I can look at those numbers and kind of understand the size of Provo and look at those numbers and say, we're not spending enough in wastewater to keep up with the needs in, whether it's O&M or CIP projects, it's just not enough. So really quickly, and I know this is a very non-sophisticated way to look at it, but if the treatment plant is valued at $100 million, and right now it's probably valued higher than that, but we're just going to use the number to make the math easy. Our project to rebuild the treatment plant, just the hydraulic side, will be about $100 million. So if you value that at 100 years and you've got $100 million and you have 100 years of life, which is not the life cycle of, it's not going to last that long. The treatment plant doesn't go that long. But I'm using two conservative numbers there. You have to be putting, just using those two numbers, you should be putting $1 million just into your treatment plant alone. And really, if you use more realistic numbers, it's higher than that. And that doesn't count the collection system. And so very quickly, I came to understand the financial history of the collection system, and it wasn't unique just to this, but we had to make some pretty significant changes financially moving forward. And you can see, and it'll become more evident as you know, moving forward, where some of these numbers are going. So I think it's also important to understand, not just from the I&I problem, but as far as the amount of resources that's needing. This is a pipe that's on University Avenue. It's a cast iron pipe, and it is a pipe. It's not an entrance to a cave. I had one of my staff say that it looks like an entrance to a cave. But it took more than a week just for an outside consulting group just to clean that pipe out. It's a cast iron pipe, which is the wrong type of material. It was put in probably in the 50s, the 40s. It was an early pipe. But in order to make that functioning for, and to line it, we did the lining on that one as well right here. It took more than a week of time, just constant working from a group just to get one section line. And that helps to illustrate how much time and how far, how much effort is being taken. The latter picture, the lower picture, this is another issue. We're not even going to talk about that, but we get conduits drilled through our sewer lines on a pretty regular basis. That's a problem that happens pretty frequently. We have to go and correct that.
What is that stuff and how do you get it out? How did it get in?
This right here?
On the top one.
Oh, this one? That is corrosion that comes from the gases in wastewater. The different acids, and they start to corrode the pipe.
It's just the corrosion of the pipe.
Yep, it's just corrosion of the pipe. Sometimes when we take pictures like that, sometimes it will be greases and fat that sometimes will be in the wastewater, and they'll actually gather on the top of the pipe. But in many cases, particularly when it's a cast iron pipe, that's actual corrosion of the pipe. And so that's not just hey, I'm going to run the jetter down it and clean that out. I'm running a chain down it to try to clean that pipe out.
So Dave, that's a calcium buildup is what it is.
Are these all 4-inch lines? Or
No.
what's the minimum size that you, if we get secondary lines, or?
This is a 15-inch. That's a
15-inch.
15-inch pipe.
Can you put these linings in 4 inches if we have, it's gotta be the.
8 inch is the minimum size by state standard. So even in a small subdivision, cul-de-sac that has 4 homes on it, it's gotta be 8 inches the minimum.
Just wanted to thank you for comparing that to a cave and not a tunnel.
So we're gonna keep going because we got a little bit more to cover here. So as far as rates, we talked to the council before. Again, I think the history is is important to kind of understand. So this is average monthly cost by fiscal year going back to 1998, and I've said this before. I think in fiscal year 2015 was the first really significant rate increase that I had recommended to the council, and at the time we made a comparison to lots of cities in Utah County, even up into Salt Lake County, looking at it, and we were almost 35% behind the second lowest city. We were the lowest city as far as rates, and I get it. I understand, that's important to keep your rates low. But there's also a point where you're getting too low and you're not keeping up, and it's gone, many, many years, and probably to the detriment of the system that we're trying to keep up. So that led to a series of rate increases, 5 or 6 years worth of recommendations that came from Public Works. And I'm the one, I told Mayor Kafusi, I told Mayor Curtis the same thing. If you want to blame somebody, blame your Public Works Director, because this is not an elected official's issue. This is coming from Public Works in order to keep up with what's going on with our wastewater system. And we've also talked to the council before. Most of the rate increases that we've recommended to the council level off. Jimmy, do we have a water increase next year, or is it
Inflation.
It's just that inflation. So we're back in the 1-2% and we recommend keeping up with inflation just so that we don't find ourselves in the same predicament again in those utilities, whether it's water or sanitation, other places. We want to keep up with the needs, with the O&M needs in those utilities. But with wastewater, we have at least a couple of more years where you're going to see significant recommendations for increases, and it's primarily for the treatment plant and for CIP projects throughout the city. And you can see those fiscal years and the increases that we're going to be recommending. This comes out. This is a chart that came out of this master plan that I mentioned right at the beginning of the presentation. Bowen and Collins did the study, and you can see in 2013 when we adopted the study, we were. This is a line of where we were at actually, and they had already made recommendations for 2 or 3 years that we move our rates up. You can see this dashed black line right here is where the rates should have been in their opinion. And just kind of a recovery of rates. One thing that this next chart we modified in-house, so the yellow line is showing actual rate revenue, and the council's seen this before, and somebody may come back and say, well, why did you go above this dashed line right here? When you got back to the dashed line, why didn't you start? You have to remember that this master plan covered only the pipe system. It did not look at the treatment plant. And so in looking at the treatment plant and the studies and the follow-through that happened with the treatment plant and the regulations, we had to come back and make more adjustments and recommendations to the council for even additional rate increases. And so if you look back, right now the average residential monthly bill in Provo is about $55, and by 2023 will be in the low 80s. That will be our average residential bill. So back to the to the map that I mentioned to the council earlier this year that we gave them.
Dave, before you move on to that map, where does that put us at 88? You said we were 35% below anybody else before. Where does that 88 put us now?
Jimmy, do you have that for wastewater right now? I can tell you it'll be one of the highest. I know Salt Lake City on their website, Salt Lake City is doing very much the same thing. They're being very proactive with their treatment plant. They have a $500 million renovation of their treatment plant underway. And they have told their residents that they will be in the mid-80s at least, if not higher than that, about the same time. And I think most of the cities along the Wasatch Front are going to grapple with this at some point. When those regulations hit in 2035, if you're at a treatment plant that has not prepared to take phosphorus and nitrogen out, there's going to be some very quick action that's going to need to happen.
And if I could just make a comment on that last slide. Yeah, that one. I looked at that and I just absolutely cringe at that yellow line. But for two reasons. One, for how steep that is and how high it is, looking at 2014 and beyond. But also, I think we should also be cringing at where it was going back. And I feel like, to talk about like area under the curve, I think that the area under the curve going forward and how high it is trying to make up for all of that area under the curve in the past where we were under investing, and I just, it's painful. It's absolutely painful. It's painful for all of us. But I also applaud the leaders of the city, the department directors, mayor when she gets here, for not kicking the can down the road and paying the piper. And it is painful, and our citizens will feel it. And it's sad, but I think it's the right thing to do. It's the responsible thing to do, which hasn't always been done in the past.
Well, and I appreciate that, and I've told the council before, I appreciate the support of the council and the administration. We've had a number of very difficult conversations over the years. Like I said, I'm skipping through a lot of very hard times and tough recommendations that have had to go forward. And we're making up for a lot of ground. So please.
So for a long time, we were not collecting, like you say, enough to really address future needs. Maybe they came close or covered the current needs, but the way I look at infrastructure is kind of like the baby boomers after World War II. I mean, yes, we had a whole generation that just blossomed, but we also had a country that was building subdivisions and growing like crazy and putting all this infrastructure in the ground that only has like a 50, 60-year life. And when that life is up, you're stuck with the bill. And some of ours is even older, right? 90-year-old, and way beyond expected life. And we are now facing the necessity of addressing all those needs that for a long time really weren't that apparent, but now they are.
So, the comment that I would add to that is, one of the significant things that you have to keep in mind, and I know in other presentations we don't have, we called it the spaghetti graph that Jimmy had in one of the presentations about a year and a half ago. We had a number of options, and if you remember, we're not just financing the current plan, but we're actually trying to get enough revenue. So in 2030, 2035, we do not have to go out and bond for that phase of the project that I mentioned at the treatment plant. And that is one of the most difficult challenges, I think, for a city, is to understand my infrastructure is wearing away, and I have to plan for that replacement of that infrastructure. New cities, it's really easy for new cities, to say, hey, we got to figure out how to put it in the ground, but very few of them say, how do we replace that in 40 or 50 or 60 years? And I've worked for a number of cities, and it's one of the toughest things to convince a city to look at. And again, applauding the council, the administration. In water, if you remember, we made again, some very distinct decisions about water tanks that have to be replaced. We have 3 reservoirs that are 60-plus years. One of them is 85-plus years old. The 2 reservoirs up by the MTC and the one that's up in Rock Canyon, all of those reservoirs will need to be replaced in short order. And it's been 3-4 years ago, the council specifically in the finance plan started setting rates so that we could set money aside. Jimmy, how much do we have set aside for, I ask you this all the time, and I apologize for putting you on the spot.
I could tell you off the top of my head.
And we're putting aside for the 48 million, the 48-inch pipe as well that we talked about on replacing the primary feed. But I think between those 3 accounts that I'm talking about, we have in excess of $5 million. So if we had one of the tanks, the main or the gallery reservoir, that simply had to be replaced tomorrow, we could. You have enough in water account right now that you could simply replace that without having to have any kind of conversation about a bond, anything, no rate increase. We just simply go and replace it tomorrow if we needed to. So moving forward, we have a spreadsheet. You've seen this spreadsheet. I'm only going to show you the top portion unless you want to see the other portions. We have 4 categories in the spreadsheet that go out to about 10 years. And the only reason that I'm showing you the top 2 portions of the spreadsheet is because they build the backbone infrastructure that I mentioned, or their short-term solutions to add capacity on the west side. So the short-term solutions are in the blue, the backbone is in the tan color on the top. And so you can see in fiscal year 19, with the revenue that was coming in, you can see the projects over here that are being funded. The Duncan Aviation line, the line that's out on the Lakeview Parkway between Center Street and, is it 600 South, 500 South? And then coming down toward the master lift station. And the master lift station is planned out by the airport right at the bottom of that line. We have a contractor that's building that, and that all of that you see on the map will be completed by October of this year, October 19. And you can just look at the totals. That's the cost that we're putting in to put those pipes in the ground. In 21, so this is the coming fiscal year, you can see what is associated. So we'll start the master lift station that I mentioned right here. This is a force main that the master lift station will pick the waste up and push it to the east. It discharges right now into an existing 36-inch line that makes a turn right here. This is 1600 west, and is that 1150 south?
Yes.
And it will discharge into the 36, and you can see again the cost that in the coming fiscal year that we'll need to install those again the backbone infrastructure. You can also see the extension of the line up the Lakeview Parkway on the road behind the new high school, again servicing the north, what I call the northwest corner of the city. In the following fiscal year, in 2022, you can see the master lift station. It's another year because we can't fund the entire master lift station in 1 year, so we fund it over 2 years. And again, I&I projects throughout the city. And then there's 2 more years. In 2024, we eliminate 2 existing lift stations out on the west side, the Harbor Park and the Skipper Bay. And we start funding the parallel 36 that I've mentioned a couple of times. And in 2025 is the last fiscal year for the parallel 36. And so once that infrastructure that you see, when I talk about the backbone infrastructure on the west side, what's on the map is the backbone. So you can see the line that I was talking about right here, that is not on that map. And there's going to probably be other lines, and we see that from time to time. Developers come and say, hey, I want the city to put this, pipe in. It's a 12-inch pipe. You have to realize the pipes that we're putting in, we're talking about, these are big pipes, 42-inch. That blue one that goes down to the master lift station, it's a 42-inch pipe. These are These are not ribs. These are the backbones.
So, we only have so much money and we try to prioritize. I give you great credit for what you're doing. Is it fair to say that we had to change some of our priorities, roads and infrastructure for the new high school building?
We did alter CIP project schedules, yes.
Right, and that influences other areas where we were expecting to do something and we had to postpone it.
Yeah, so the question has come up on this, relative to development, and this is what you're going to get asked, and whether it's a developer or somebody else coming to you and saying, hey, I want to be first in line, so will you build the 36 instead of going up the Lakeview Parkway, and building that pipe that goes up toward the high school. And generally my answer is, this is what we presented to the city council. This is the plan moving forward financially. So if you want to alter that plan, then you need to go and have a conversation about, this plan with the city council. And I think that's exactly what Wayne is telling the development community is, here's the plan. This is how soon we're going to have that particular pipe in the ground. You want to change that. That's a policy call from the city council. Please.
So if some of these larger developers or the school district or someone is wanting to put things in, wants things in a way that we cannot finance currently, can we not have them fund it up front and reimburse them through an agreement on our schedule? Can that happen in order to move these things forward rather than the city wanting?
Yeah, and I think you're kind of starting to touch on, this is why we kind of ended this presentation where we did, is because I think you're starting to touch on the policy questions. Is, do you want to do that? What's the legal ramifications? Do you want to commit to, that repayment in 2024, 2025, whatever, year it is that what the city council wants to do? And I think that's largely what, we're saying the same thing I think that Wayne did in his introduction, just in a little bit different language.
I think there's lots of questions and discussion to be had. We're about 5 minutes away from the allotted 60 minutes. I know you're coming back in 2 weeks for further discussion. So I guess I wanted to ask you, how would you like to use the next 5 minutes? And if you can help us with our expectations. If we have questions, do we hold on to that for 2 weeks? Or what would you?
No, I think in 2 weeks, I think you're largely going to hear from the development community and others. And I don't know if Wayne has some other plan that he hasn't told me about, but I think you're going to hear a lot less from me in 2 weeks. I think you're going to hear more from the development side. And how do we accelerate this? The only thing that I would add to the presentation that we really haven't, I was going to skip ahead. I think that's the last slide. Is that right, Jimmy? The only thing that I would add to this presentation is, I'm going to go way back in this and find a map. That map right there. The one thing that I would add in the last 5 minutes is we've talked in that short term, in the blue section of the spreadsheet, we talked about a diversion. We talked about diversions over here on the west side. I think I'm trying to identify this one right here on 2770 West. This was a short-term solution where we diverted flow away from the Lakeshore Drive that allowed Ivory Homes some additional capacity on Lakeshore. It was a short-term solution, and it only added a few homes, but it was worth moving that forward. We're looking at a similar diversion over here on 500 North and 800 West, and it's a more significant diversion. We've actually done this in the past. As I talked with some of our collections people that have been here for a long period of time, they actually said, and in the past they've actually run this line down through the subdivision the way it's identified right there, and have not had problems with it. So actually this week we met and I asked for the wastewater crews to actually replace that diversion. It's not going to be permanent, but we're going to put that back in place and kind of watch it in today's condition and find out if we create problems downstream. We're going to monitor it very carefully. We have meters in place to watch what's happening. And And that may, and I use that very carefully, that may give us an option to do some additional development that would discharge into the 36. You can see what we're doing here, because right now the wastewater that's collected in this part of the city actually runs across I-15 down here and back across I-15 all the way to the treatment plant. We've talked about that before. And we're going to try to shortcut this and divert it down this pipe right here. This is a large, I think it's an 18 and a 24-inch pipe. It's a relatively good sized pipe. It's certainly not a 36. But by doing that, we may be adding additional homes that could connect to the 36. It's not going to solve every single problem on the west side. If there's a development that goes into the Skipper Bay, if there's something that goes into Lake Shore Drive, someplace that's got another capacity problem upstream from the 36, we're not going to be solving that problem with that diversion. But we may be giving some opportunities for some development, limited. And I don't know the numbers yet. We're not going to make that, that recommendation to the council until we have a little bit more information on that diversion. So
the status quo with respect to zone change requests and site plan approvals?
Probably going to still continue to see until we hear more of a policy decision. Would like to get a little bit more direction from the council. If there are some additional residential units, like Wayne said, how does the council want us to allocate those additional units? Do they go to parcels that are already zoned? Do they go to development that's adjacent to the 36? How do you want us to do that?
And then, Mr. Parker, if I could direct that to you, I mean, we are down to a minute.
Right.
But you let out with some questions. We have a lot more information now, but it seems like it's going to take a policy discussion before we can find that. Do we feel like that's going to be coming in 2 weeks, or is that going we'll need to reschedule or schedule something beyond 2 weeks?
Again, it's hard for me to tell you that without hearing the presentation from the development community.
Okay.
I think you want to look at that, consider what's included in their discussion, then either after that next Tuesday or in a subsequent work meeting, or maybe even a special meeting where we just focus on this for an extended period of time and really have the deep policy discussion. What you've heard is sort of one side to the equation, which is what does our infrastructure look like today and what's our current plan moving forward. If you feel compelled by some of the discussion you have in 2 weeks, you may want to rethink that. And again, I think that would require a little more robust discussion on the part of the council. So you may want to do that in a separate meeting. But I think the bottom line is we have to continue to move the question forward until we reach a conclusion.
We're not assuming you're going to want more than we're currently planning.
And at the risk of telling you what I think they're going to say, let me tell you what I think they're going to say. And again, you may feel that much differently. I think what you're going to hear is we are at an unprecedented moment in the housing market today. As we've shown you the numbers, that we have way more households being created than we have dwelling units being created along the Wasatch Front. And Utah County is no exception to that. And particularly desirable areas in the center part of the county where you don't have to commute as far to get to work and to school and healthcare and all those things, are putting a lot of pressure on the market today. And developers are kind of in a position now where they've hit a little bit of a sweet spot. Land prices are very expensive, and we get that, and that's again driven by the market. There's an interest in doing more units in an effort to grow the base of available housing units, and thus, when the supply increases, the cost can become more affordable in the aggregate. Whether they're building a lot of affordable units or they're providing opportunities for people in housing units to buy up a little bit, it creates now an opening at the lower end of the housing market. And so there's a little bit of an opportunity now that may not exist 3 or 4 or 5 years from now. And so I think one of the things you'll hear them talk about is the demand in the market and their concern about trying to locate in the central part of the county as opposed to just doing it in San Antonio. Where again we add commute costs and air quality issues and a variety of things. And they have they have lined up property owners, and we're confronting this issue, and it came up a little bit in the discussion on the West Side Plan, that we now have farmers who are in some cases anticipating that the value of this land was their retirement investment, and as the city now kind of comes back and says we have limited capacity, it's going to take more time, we may be creating some unanticipated impacts on the landowners on the west side as well. So that there's sort of a wide variety of pressures coming to bear on the question of development. And so again, as we talk about that next time, I think what we're hoping that you hear is the complexity. I told the mayor when she first came into office, I said, most commonly, the residents who come in angry and upset and want to talk to somebody in the mayor's office, they talk about their story, and then my most common first response is, it's not as easy as you think. And we begin to talk about all the moving parts around any given issue. And pretty soon there's an appreciation that these are really tough decisions. They are not simple, they're not monolithic, they have complexity. And what I'm hoping you will hear is not only the complexity from our staff and the engineers and the technicians who have concerns about our infrastructure, but you'll also hear the other side of the equation, which is what's happening in the development community, what are the pressures on the west side. And again, there are lots of moving parts. There's agricultural preservation, there's growing slowly, to accommodate some of these other concerns like roads and trails and additional infrastructure on the west side that would argue for maybe a little slower approach. But under any scenario, you should hear all of that before you reach a policy decision. So yeah, I think you'll hear pressure to do it faster, to do it a little more surgically, and that could involve some other funding strategies beyond the ones we have traditionally looked at, which are user fees and impact fees.
I guess it would be fair to ask them how they're going to help us fund it.
Yes.
The landowners and the developers, they want to have it happen, and we have a plan that's already very expensive for the residents. How are they going to help us fund it?
Yeah, and in part, and as I think you appreciated looking at the numbers that Dave suggested, that if timing were not an issue, in 10 years we'll largely have the wastewater problem solved. Now, that's 10 years, right? Now, could some components of that be done in 3 years if we used, and again, whether those might be improvement agreements or revenue bond or some other approach to accelerate the process and have, whether that's increased impact fees or a more specific impact fee service area. It could be developers front-ending costs using their impact fee credits to pay for part of that, with the city paying later from other impact fees or user fees generated in the area. There's a variety of ways we might think about this. And again, part of what we've asked the development community to do is come in and say, you've developed in other cities, we've looked at what other cities do, what do you think are good approaches to that? And what other tools might we look at that would, again, be at least in part funded by the development community, perhaps in part funded by future user fees that we've generated in our system. So again, I think there's a wide variety of choices and opportunities to look at. What I think we'd like to have you do is think through the policy implications and then come back and say, we'd like to look at a couple of scenarios. One of those might be, can we advance a third of the projects that would take us out 5 years? Can we make those happen in 3 years? And if so, what does that look like? What would that do to impact fees, user rates, improvement agreements, infrastructure financing of some kind or another? Or if you come back from a policy perspective and say, you know what, we're just fine with what we've come up with, the policy we established is the one we like, then we go to the development community and say, what you got is what you got, and if there are consequences, then those are there. But at least we've had the policy level discussion to address it. Now, I know that took more than my minute.
No, that's okay. So I think we have a better appreciation of what to expect from the next conversation, and when is the time to be asking these type of questions. So it sounds like it's probably better to hear from these others, and then we'll figure out when and how to have these policy questions. Mr. Henley has a question, and then if anyone has burning questions that have to be asked right now, we would take those for 30 seconds, and then we'll move on. We're still trying to dig out from where lead starts.
Well, this is maybe more of a request for next time, but it would be helpful to have an understanding of the difference it makes if we advance anything at all on this plan. Once we have development, what kind of revenue does that then
Yes.
provide the city? Does that
Yeah.
change the financial picture if suddenly any portion of the west side is more developed than it is now at a sooner point?
Yes.
Anyway, that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out how we.
Yeah, and again, I think our suggestion was if you kind of reach some general policy, broad policy parameters, it would be easier for us to go in and then do the full financial modeling. And so if you said something like, I think we could certainly tell you if you advance certain projects forward, we could add X number of available units, and assuming that reached a build out in 2 or 3 years, here's what the impact fee revenues would be, here's what the user fee revenue, additional user fee revenues would be. I think we can help you with that. But again, I think what we're hoping is as you reach some broad policy parameters that you could suggest to us some things you'd like to see us model, and maybe come up with 3 or 4 or 5 scenarios from one end of the spectrum to the other that we could help model and at least drive the decision a little closer to reality.
Any other questions? All right, thank you. We will move on to the next item, which I believe Mr. Decker is also presenting. It is a discussion regarding a resolution authorizing city administration to accept a state of Utah infrastructure bank fund loan for improvements related to the Provo Airport Terminal Project. And this is budgeted for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Harding. And if you don't mind, there's actually 2 items that follow this that are public works related and airport related. And I'd like to do the presentation on both of them at the same time. I think it'll make more sense if I do them together, so.
Yeah, I think that's great. So let me just read in the 4th item is a discussion regarding an inter-fund loan from the energy fund to the wastewater fund for sewer improvements related to the new airport terminal.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for the opportunity. So I believe it was Mr. Connect that asked the question as far as priority changes in the last presentation, and this is actually a really good example of we have to do a little bit of a priority adjustment for sewer at the airport. So when this was originally funded for sewer at the airport, it's not funded until next fiscal year. July of next year, 2020 would be, so it's fiscal year 21 when this sewer project was originally funded in the spreadsheet. But given our circumstance with funding at the terminal, and also the fact that we have a contractor that is highly not only available but very talented in what they're doing out on the west side, would like to advance the project about 6 months. So right now, if they finish if you remember the backbone, the blue line that went down to the master lift station, they're planned to finish that in about October, and they're telling us that they can mobilize and move their equipment and start at the airport sometime late November, early December. And so we would like permission from the council and from the administration to be able to keep that contractor going and start the sewer line at the airport. Otherwise, you're going to have a 6-month gap. You're going to have to rebid it, and it's probably not the best approach from a timing standpoint. So what it requires is a loan, and we're recommending an interfund loan, and John Borgett is in the back. John and Jimmy are going to help me with this presentation a little bit here. But the state does allow interfund loans. There's some very strict rules that have to be followed, and John's going to go through those rules. But we're asking the council to authorize, it's a $4 million loan, and it would allow us to utilize that money to pay the contractor until July 1st, and then the wastewater utility fee would repay that energy loan, and it would be about a 6-month loan that would end up taking place. So I think that's the last item, Mr. Harding, that you read into the item. So that's the broad summary of the energy, and I think Jimmy and John have a little bit more detail. The other loan that we're looking at is from the state of Utah. It's actually administered through UDOT. And we were made aware that UDOT, even though transportation is normally thought of in cars and pedestrians and air transportation is actually part of their function. And they have an infrastructure loan that we became aware of, and they encouraged us actually to apply for this loan. And we're going through the steps to make you aware of this, but not necessarily going to take a resolution to you to authorize, actually sign on the loan. So we're asking UDOT and the Transportation Commission, which meets in September. What day is it, Brian? 20th. The 20th of September. We're actually asking the Transportation Commission of UDOT to approve our application and then to hold it somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 90 days. Now, the reason that we're doing that is we're actually out looking for other sources of money for the loop road, the terminal, the apron that we've been talking with the council about. We've mentioned MAG. We've also looking at a couple of other federal sources as far as money. But we won't know the results of those sources that we're looking at until spring of 2020. So next June, July, maybe May timeframe, we'll start to know some of those sources. So instead of waiting for those sources, and particularly if they don't give us everything that we're asking for, we thought it would be prudent to start the application process with UDOT. So those are the two, again, broad summary of the loans that we're looking for. Jimmy and John, do you guys want to run through some details?
Yeah, like Dave mentioned, there are, the state code allows interfund loans within the city. There are some parameters around that we're trying to follow. And so we're planning to come back in 2 weeks for a resolution to authorize the loan and to hold a public hearing to meet those requirements of the state code. As far as the details on the repayment Dave mentioned, I've spread it out a little bit further than the 6 months, depending on, which will depend on the construction schedule of the contractor. But it would be, as he mentioned, a $4 million loan that would bridge the gap between our current need and the FY21 budget that starts in July. And one of the requirements is that we keep we charge an interest rate on that loan, and we want to be competitive with the Public Treasurer's Investment Fund that the city uses, so that Energy won't be missing out on the money that they would be getting from having that money invested instead. And so with that interest rate, based on the current returns of the PTIF, it's called, this would be the breakdown of to repay $4 million in July. It'd be about $78,000 in interest. John, did you have any?
I just maybe make a couple of points. First of all, I would mention that I've talked to Travis about this, our energy director, and he's supportive. It is a fairly short-term loan. I feel confident that it does meet the state guidelines for interfund loans. The other thing I would mention is that what we're going to propose, we wouldn't want to use the interest on this towards or offsetting against any other wastewater projects. So our recommendation is that we have the general fund cover the interest. The other thing is that we've kind of prepared a proposed schedule we'd want the council to approve, but if the invoices that actually came from the contractor came in a little slower or the interest was lower, we wouldn't charge the general fund that extra interest, or because Energy will either have their money invested in the PTIF, the state PTIF fund, or this fund, and so we would charge the interest based on what the actual stream goes. But we think this is conservative, likely to be a little slower than this, and so I think this is a great source. And the other thing that's good is that we've already got a plan in our CIP fund for the $4 million in fiscal 21, and so I feel like there's very little risk. It's just a timing issue. The other thing
do you need a motion to move it forward tonight, or is it already there?
I think the plan is to talk about it in the September meeting, and so I'm not sure. I think we've already got that plan. I don't know if we need a motion or not.
So what's not showing there is if we didn't do this, there would be a cost associated with delaying and rebidding and all of that.
Which would likely require much more cost, and as Dave mentioned, some concern about having the right experienced contractor there to do the work, because the groundwater level's high and it's complex. And they've just already demonstrated that they can do a great job.
and the mobilization charges coming back again in the future.
Make one other comment up here. We've spent considerable time and had some good discussions on this UDOT loan, and I just want to mention a couple things. First of all, yeah, is that, as mentioned here, it is a very attractive interest rate. We actually think that the rate's going to be a little less than that because overall long-term rates have gone down since July, and so likely will be less. Now, it's based on when they have their meeting on the 20th of September, and so they could go back up, but I still feel like it's a very attractive rate. The other big thing is there's no issuance fees or no fees that we have to pay to a financial advisor, and so it saves money there. And so this just looks like a good option, and I think we've got some good options down the road on when this would need to be repaid. Because our estimate is that the construction of the terminal would hopefully be complete in December 21.
That's the latest.
That's a rough estimate that we've got, and the payment wouldn't be due till a year after that, which would be December 22. And we feel like we've got some options there that Dave mentioned that we're looking at. So.
John, when you say the payment will be due, does that mean we're only paying interest for a while? Or
no,
is it fully amortized?
It's a principal and interest fully amortized level payment for 5 years.
The first payment will be due in fall of '22.
Yes. 1 year from when we give them the date for the completion of the terminal. Any other question for me?
Well, another question. This interest then would have to be come out of the general fund, out of our reserves, basically, because we don't have any appropriation for that. Is that right? And
I think what our plan is, and I think Dave did a good job mentioning that, what we want to do is we still need a little bit more time to plan and prepare for the funding for the terminal, and that's why we're like the 90 days. And so we are still going to come back at a future date and give you more of the specifics. We know what we want to do with the wastewater improvements and the interfund loan, but we're hopeful the council is supportive of us further looking into this loan, and then we'll come back with more of the specifics later.
well, I just want to mention, I am so grateful that you're willing to do this, and I think this is such an opportunity right now to be able to look at this and to get this terminal in. I think that this is something, what an opportunity we have right now, and I don't want to miss it, so thank you.
Yeah.
I do have a question. I appreciate the presentation so far. It's really helped, at least me, understand the reason why we're doing this, the parameters around it and all that. I have to say, just kind of at face value, I was a little wary that we're opening a Pandora's box where, with future needs, we might say, well, oh, this is an easy pot to pull from. So I appreciate, we are doing this very tentatively, and I think for good reason. A couple times we've mentioned that we feel that this meets all of the parameters, all of the requirements set by the state. In a nutshell, can you give us the top 3 or 4 things that we have to comply with in order to legally do fund loan?
Oh, as far as
what does the state require?
What the state requires is, number one, that it has to be 10 years or less, okay? That there has to be identified a clear repayment plan, and that there also has to be in writing, has to be approved by council with a public hearing, and that the interest rate needs to be commensurate with what they would be earning for the fund. And those are the requirements.
Thank you.
Sitting with the energy board, they are very protective of their reserve, and I'm grateful for that, because we're just barely getting to the point where we're starting to feel that this is where we should be. We're not even quite there yet, I don't think, are we, John? We're real close.
Yeah, when we just were having those, we went to that little seminar that talked about it. We were very, very close, and we've made a lot of progress.
Yeah. A lot of progress, but they are protective of that, and I'm grateful that they are. Travis is it's a running conversation with Travis watch you be careful with what we've been working so hard to attain. So in an emergency and in a great opportunity, I think this is something we can look at. I'm grateful for their protectiveness of their reserves also.
And we also had looked at, for this specific loan, maybe longer term, but when we looked at the wastewater treatment, when we looked at the wastewater's capitalization plan and where it was funded, we did it over as short a term as possible so that we could get that repaid, save on interest, and get it taken care of. Another reason why we did it as well is that as we're looking at getting all the pieces together for the terminal, we still may need to come back with some other ideas for this to work, and so we like the idea of let's solve this wastewater issue because we need the infrastructure anyway, and then we'll come back with the full plan at a later date.
Any other questions? Do you have anything else? All right.
That's all we had.
All right, so, but you are looking for some direction on this loan.
If I'm not mistaken, Jimmy or Hannah, is this scheduled for the 10th of September, or is it tonight?
The interfund loan is for the 10th, yes.
Okay, so.
So we'll need to notice it and have a resolution that night.
Okay. Now, we won't necessarily be approving anything or authorizing anything. Just at that point, that's when you're looking for direction that, yes, we would like you to look into it. Is that what I understood?
The UDOT loan?
Yes, the UDOT.
So,
Yeah.
so remember, there are two loans here. The first one is the interfund loan, which Jimmy indicated on the 10th. We'll have a resolution for you to adopt for that. On the 20th of September, the State Transportation Commission reviews our application, either approves it or denies it. At that point, we have 60 to 90 days to get a resolution from council to receive that state infrastructure bank loan.
Okay.
So we
nothing's needed right now.
anticipate October, maybe even November, coming to you for a resolution to accept monies from the state infrastructure bank fund.
There's one other thing that will come back with you, along with the interfund loan, will be an appropriation for the $4 million for the wastewater improvement, because they would have been part of the 21 budget, and school need to appropriate that so they can spend those funds this fiscal year instead of next.
Okay, but nothing is necessarily being requested of us in today's meeting, correct? Okay. I almost want to, though, just give our reaction, because I believe we're very supportive of both of these efforts. So I don't know if we want to make that a formal
I'd like to make a motion on it so they know where they are.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stewart.
I'm not making a motion.
Motion to voice support for both of
For
them.
both of these funding sources for the projects enumerated.
Okay. Is there a second on that motion? All right, I think I saw Mr. Knick's hand first, so we'll go with Mr. Knick on that. All in favor of this motion?
Could I have one
Yes,
discussion
please.
first?
Sorry,
Brian, are
discussion.
we okay to, is this something that we can vote on this? This is all?
Sure, well, because
Okay.
it's just a motion of support.
Okay, thank you.
It has no legal bearing, it's just indicating support to
Okay.
the staff, so that they know that you're not going to shoot them down when they come back in a month.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson.
Well, actually, it doesn't mean they can't shoot them down.
Well, yes.
You're indicating keep working on it.
The intent right now is
Yeah.
yes, shoot them down.
All right, any other questions, any other discussion? All right, all in favor? That's unanimous, Mr. Sewell exceeds. All right,
Hey,
thank you very much.
thank you very much.
And we have a break scheduled, so we will take a 5-minute break. And I request that everyone keep it 5 minutes.
So you're like one of those chips, and I'm like, hey, there's a vote. Yeah, I went looking for them, I didn't know where they'd gone.
Yes.
Call the meeting back to order and move forward with item 5, a discussion regarding the annexation of a property generally located at 1860 South in Colorado Avenue, partially in the East Bay neighborhood. And just a heads up, there's been a request and we're going to be about on the right time, the original planned start time. So I think after this we will be jumping to item 8. A discussion on the S&A overlay.
We could do item 6 probably quickly too if you wanted to.
They have to do 5 and 6 and 8.
5, 6, and 7. So we're just going to bump 7 back, just a heads up. So let's jump into item 5, being presented by Mr. Brian Maxfield, Provo City Planner.
Thank you. If you recall, this is an annexation request down by 1860 South. You accepted the annexation petition a month and a half ago. This is now the annexation, which went through the process of getting a recommendation from the Planning Commission. They gave a favorable recommendation. At the time, we talked about the other areas next to it, which is kind of shown in this lighter gray. Those are not now in the city, but we're working on a larger annexation in the near future, which would take in some of these other areas. The property owner for this one also owns one of the other properties, working on the third, and that's underway actually. So what we would request is a favorable motion on the annexation at this point, with the understanding some of these other areas will come in at a later time. Any questions?
I do. How likely do you said some of these other properties, how likely do you think, which ones do you think will be annexed in the future?
The annexation, there are two main requirements. One, that you have 51% of the owners, and another, a third of the property value.
Right.
One of these properties is owned by the applicant. The other one, I believe they're trying to obtain, and so they would have control. Some of the other ones are the railroad and the city properties, which would come in. And so, we're pretty confident we can at least get through the road. The bottom part on the other side of the road, the south side, is owned by Pacific States Cast Iron, and that may not be likely. That would also be a majority of the land and everything else, so we could not force that in. But we would at least be able to clean everything up down to the road.
Okay, so the annexation plan does go down to.
Actually goes down through Springville all the way down to all the Pacific States Cast Iron.
Okay.
So we go quite deep. There are some other properties. There's another city-owned property down here and some others that we could get in, but there's some private ownerships between some of those. So Pacific States is the main one we would have to convince to come in the city.
Okay, and that was just my one concern was, by allowing this one in, does it make it harder to reach that 51% or 30%, whatever that was, because we're now bringing this one in, and I was worried that we might be losing some urgency, we might be losing potentially even some numbers to get us to that, but it sounds like...
It doesn't really affect that at all, just because of the amount of land and value involved.
Okay. Gary, did you have a...
Just had a question about, they're not proposing a zone, so we're going M1, is that what it is, or they got a...
They would like a zone, but by default, under the annexation, you go to the least intense of the zone allowed by the general plan. The general plan is industrial for this area, and so you really have a choice between principally M1 and M2. M1's the lighter of the two. Both allow the proposed use.
And we don't have a project necessarily.
There is storage units proposed.
It is
a storage unit project.
That's what the names.
I was a little confused. The staff recommended that we maybe request an annexation agreement for the rest of the property, but then the Planning Commission, the owner said something about wanting the city to provide an annexation proposal. So I'm not sure I understood that.
I believe Public Works talked about trying to get more land, and what we determined at that point, because they did control the other piece and other factors involved, it would unnecessarily delay, processing this initial request to drop a larger annexation plat to get everybody else on board, to get the other pieces involved. And so we recommended going ahead. We didn't think an annexation agreement was necessary in the sense that it's not really a utility user. It's not a lot of water and sewer and other things that way.
So But we do not, are we being, is the owner requesting an annexation proposal at this point, or am I not understanding that correctly?
You're requesting the annexation, meaning an agreement of some kind, or?
Well, I'm just reading over the Planning Commission report, and the owner says she stated that their ownership would support the annexation of their other property if the city brought forth an annexation proposal for the larger area of the future.
Yeah, and their other one is this property right down here.
Yeah.
And so what we're working on now is the larger annexation. That's what they said they'd support.
So there's no action on our part that's needed to
No, not until we come back with that larger
So
one.
if at a future date we request that we annex, they're stating that they're willing to support that if we do that in the future. Any other questions? All right, Mr. Maxwell. And this is on tonight's.
Correct.
Okay, number 6 is a discussion regarding an ordinance amending the zone map classification of the property located at 800 North University Ave, known as the Amanda Knight Hall. From public facilities to campus mixed use. It's in the Joaquin neighborhood and will be presented by Dustin Wright, Provost Airport.
Thank you. So here are some images of, I think this is Allen Knight Hall. It's on the same block. It got demolished, and then here is Amanda Knight Hall as it was being constructed back in 1938-39. So there's just some images of that. And then here's some current photos of Amanda Knight Hall. And so recently, BYU last year wanted to demolish the building for future development needs that they had. And the neighborhood's been working towards encouraging them to not demolish that historic building. And so they decided to sell it. So the building was sold to the applicant that's now requesting rezone. Here's the location. It's 800 North University Avenue, close proximity there to BYU and the new UBX stations as well. And here's the zoning for the property. So BYU's properties are typically in the public facility zone, shown there. It's surrounded by the campus mixed use zone in the north, east, and south. And that's the zone that they're requesting, so that whole area would become campus mixed use. So basically, staff's reviewed this request and feels like it's a good opportunity to meet our general plan goals, to preserve historic structures within our neighborhoods that have significance, like this one does. Some of the issues I think would be, as far as it being a historic structure, there's limited parking on site, and so the applicant has proposed a few ways that they can address that. Staff recommends that we approve it, even knowing that what they're doing is they're bringing it back to its historical use as well, so preserve the structure and bring it back to that historic use of women's housing. And so we recognize that the parking situation there is going to be just a non-conforming situation, but it should be sufficient with its proximity to, like I mentioned, UBX stations and proximity to BYU, and then the applicant's willingness to work with new tenants that go there and how they'll be able to limit them based on the contracts that they sign for the housing. So that's kind of a basic overview of this request, going from the public facilities to the campus mixed use.
Do you have a sense of what kind of strategies they will use about the cars? Are they going to?
So the one that they mentioned at the Planning Commission was part of their rental agreements with the tenants would be restricting them to not have a car on some of them. Obviously, they've got
a certain number of cars per room or something.
They've got a certain amount of parking spaces available on site. Yeah. There's not really a way to expand that or create more parking, so they're looking at additional ways to make sure that
we're going to be able to rely on them to enforce that.
Yeah, I mean it's going to be up to them to to make those contracts and work through it to keep their tenants happy and wanting to stay there.
So I like what's happening here. I mean, restoring and preserving an old historic place like this is awesome. It's a great location. I don't have a lot of confidence in anybody making promises like that. And I feel we can best bring equity and balance to the streets of Joaquin with the parking permit program, and we're looking at that.
Yeah, and so that's another protection I think that would be in place as well to help that.
This is this is just a really ticky-tack thing, but in the bulletin and somewhere in the documentation, it calls it a girls' dormitory. It's a women's dormitory, just to be clear. These are grown women who are going to live there.
And it wouldn't be a dormitory. These units, as they get recreated, are going to have their individual kitchens and bathrooms within the unit. So they'll be more apartments than a dormitory.
Are the exceptions that they're looking for standard exceptions because it's a historical? I mean, do we kind of throw things out the window at times for a historical building? I don't know the regulations for parking if it is historical.
Yes. The way that we're looking at it is that they're converting it back to a historical use that was once there. And so as far as parking goes, we're looking at that as a non-conforming parking situation. Even the use that BYU had there, before they sold it, as classrooms and offices and things like that, the use exceeded what our current parking is or would be if it came in and built a new building today. But since it's a historic structure, we just have the parking as a non-conforming portion of that. So that's.
Are there I think there's probably other homes in our area that could qualify for that type of thing. It says, I just don't want to have to worry about parking. Is that what we're telling them? You don't have to worry about it, basically?
I think it's a little bit of that, but it's also something that we're trying to fulfill some of the other goals and policies within the general plan as far as historic preservation goes. And so to help accomplish that, I think this is an opportunity to say they're preserving a historic structure, which is a great thing for the city. The neighborhood's really fought hard for that. And then the historic use of the structure is also something they're looking to bring back. And so we feel like with that's something that this would makes sense, even though it's probably not the most ideal situation. I think the owner is cognizant of that issue of parking, and they're working on other ways, and so that's something you could ask them tonight on other options that they've also considered for parking issues.
Thanks.
If I could just add one comment to that. I mean, it seems to me, I know BYU's working on trying to get students to bring fewer cars, trying to encourage public transportation, et cetera, et cetera. Seems to me this is, if the owner is working closely enough with BYU and they say this is reserved for people who are committed to using public transportation. I mean, if they really make that kind of the identity of the norm, the housing unit, that could help. But I mean, it seems like there's got to be some sort of firm commitment on the owner's part. I think there are plenty of students who would jump at that, frankly. I don't think that's the problem. I think it's whether or not the owner's serious about filtering out the people who are going to abuse the situation.
I think that's a good point.
Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Wright. And we will skip over 7 and move to 8. 8 is a discussion regarding a request for an ordinance text amendment to consolidate chapter 14.30. It's the S supplemental residential overlay zone with chapter 14.46, which is the A accessory apartment overlay zone. Citywide application. This is budgeted for 25 minutes. And I have that Mr. Councilor Dave Connect will introduce it along with Mr. Brian Jones and Brian Maxwell here as well.
Okay, so I've got a staff memorandum here, and I'm going to read from some of that, but there's also a few other points I'd like to make. While this does address and provide potentially more affordable housing by allowing for the first time in the A&S overlay a detached accessory that could be built over the garage or in the backyard with the right setbacks and the right lot size. That was not the main reason why the A&S overlay has been before the Housing Committee. One reason is when you see two large chapters in the code and they're virtually identical, it's totally redundant. And we don't often get a chance to go and clean up our code, which frankly there's a lot that could be done. But the A&S overlay has a long history, especially the A overlay, in so much that when the A overlay was first instituted, it had language in there saying this is an experimental zone, we'll see how it works, and if it doesn't work, well, you can always just put an end to it. And it's been around for, I don't know, is it 30 years now, or quite a while, Brian? Yeah. And it has had a colorful history of neighborhoods having meetings over whether they would like to get into the A overlay, and generally it has failed. So it's not something that every neighborhood wants, but there are neighborhoods that have it because of tradition. The downtown, where you have accessory apartments that have been established, some of them maybe 100 years ago. And the A overlay made it clear that these neighborhoods, generally the pioneer neighborhoods, that's normal, that's acceptable. And then we have the S overlays that are around campus, Pleasant View and the Wasatch. And the rules and the history there were a little bit different because it focused on students and allowed up to 4 students per apartment. We've had complaints from people like Kirby Snyman, neighborhood chair, who felt that in his particular neighborhood, I think the North Park neighborhood, that due to a lack of education and enforcement and tracking on the part of the city, that many of these have turned into just de facto duplexes and were not owner occupied. And the owner occupancy is, of course, a very important factor in allowing this extra right. So, as far as affecting affordable housing, the A&S overlay have always been an option to provide affordable housing. And if you're familiar with them, you know that. But we're looking at increasing that opportunity by saying that if you don't have a house that lends itself to creating an accessory inside the house, and your lot is big enough, and you would like to spend the money, and it will cost you to put it in your backyard or over your garage as like a carriage house, then you could do it as long as you have the lot size that's big enough and meet the setbacks, and so you could have a detached accessory. We've heard back from almost all the neighborhoods at this point. I had a message from Kira that I got today, and I talked to Terry McCabe this morning, and Celeste this morning. We've already heard from Foothills and Wasatch and Pleasant View. So far, even though they have questions like, gee, does it still have to be owner-occupied, or can anybody do the detached? Well, yes, it has to be owner-occupied. But no one's come back and said, oh, I don't want the detached option, and that's nice to hear. The changes in the proposal are cleaning up the code and then criteria for the detached accessory are minimum of 6,000 square foot lot, which is pretty much our bottom line. It's the size of a building lot, unless you have a special zone. The height of the attached accessory less than the main dwelling, but does not exceed 20 feet in height. Minimum size of the accessory must be greater than 200 square feet, which actually brings into play some of the tiny homes that people have asked about. Setback is a minimum of 10 feet, so if you have a garage that's already there and it's closer than 10 feet, you've got a problem. But if you can maintain that 10-foot distance, accessory unit must be architecturally compatible with the main dwelling, and the unattached accessory must have separate utilities. The size of the main dwelling must be 1,200 square feet or more to have an accessory. The number of occupants in the A overlay was always 2, and now it will be 2 in both the A and the S as the underlying basic. It will remain as a limit of 2 in the A, but in the S with conditional use permit, and if you can show that you have the ability to house more than 2 and provide the parking. And the parking is a little bit relative to kind of like demand a night. Will you have 4 cars with 4 people, or will you only have 3 or 2? What we're trying to avoid is what came before us a year and a half, 2 years ago, where there was a request to bring into alignment the parking and the number of students that were allowed to live in one of these S overlay apartments. And since the maximum was 4, it was like, well, you better have 4 off-street spaces for all of them. But frankly, some of them are occupied for families that only have 2 cars, and so requiring every apartment to have 4 spaces paved seemed overkill. So we're trying to bring that back and just look at it on a case-by-case basis for those that want to have more than 2 adults, and say, okay, do you have the space and do you have the parking? Because you have a requirement to have off-street parking for every car you own and operate. Since in the last week, we've had feedback, we've met with neighborhoods, and the Wasatch neighborhood would appreciate going back to the original language, which said the accessory unit would be allowed only to be in the basement or on the 2nd story, but not on the main floor. So it's in the house, it needs to be up or down, but not on the main floor. And they had reasons that they felt that would undermine the attractiveness and functionality of a home and make it more likely that an investor would buy it. And when I say an investor, you say, well, don't they have to be owner occupied? But what they have going in the tree streets is someone will put their son or daughter on the title for 50% and they'll move in, and then they'll rent out through a bunch of students, and there's really no family there, and it's not a long-term anchor family or situation. It's just a rental, an investment. So they wanted to keep the original language that did require it being in the basement or the 2nd story and not be broadened to just allow anywhere, which would include the main level. Limiting owners to live only in the main unit of the home has come up, and the original language said that is the case, and the current proposal made it possible to live in either unit. And again, the Wasatch came back and said in their experience that this is kind of the loophole that has been used by some investors to put somebody like their daughter in the basement and rent out the top. You know, unless we have compelling reasons to change the existing language, I am inclined to stick with the existing language. And that's what I told them. And then the conditional use permit is being added to the process, where if you want more than what's allowed, which is 2 singles, then you do have to show that you're in a position to do that, whether you have the extra bedrooms and the extra parking. And it also puts the owner on notice that you could lose your conditional use permit if you really don't provide what you said you would provide. If you don't provide the parking and you have a bunch of cars on the street, then we could revoke your permit. And the last thing I'd like to bring up is, as we've talked about the situation in the Waukee neighborhood and the older parts of town where people would like to have, or maybe do have, an accessory apartment, and yet they only have a 1-car driveway, small lot, there's no way to do a double-car garage or driveway. And it's like, how do you provide 4 off-street spaces and still have an accessory? And what we've talked about is, if you institute a parking permit program in the neighborhood, and you were to have, let's say, 2 parking permits, because that's what you qualify for, those parking permits that park on the street legally could apply towards your off-street requirement, so that you would have 2 on and 2 off, and a total of 4. But that's just in discussion phases right now, so that's not a part of what we're talking right here. And the S overlay, well, some of them do have a parking permit program, it's a little informal in the Pleasant View neighborhood. I don't think there is one in the Wasatch. So that's all I've got, unless you have questions.
Are those that brought this forward, including yourself, satisfied with it the way it is?
Yes, and that includes, I would be happy to retain the original language. Sometimes you get caught up.
I'm just wondering if we can go ahead with the proposal, or you're going to have to take it back and study some more.
No, I think we need to go back. There's
You need to go back.
Yeah, to committee, right?
That would be my preference. I can explain why, but that's my preference.
Yeah, we're really close.
My preference is your preference, and I just think that there's lots of different ideas, some of them contradictory to each other. You can't take public input from 1 or 2 people and change the whole concept. It's nice to hear from them, but I just want to know if you're ready to go ahead. If not, then I like what you've done, and hope that it stays close to where it is.
Right, and I was just going to say that, when you get into cities, reviewing something line by line, and you go, oh, well, we could do this different, we could do that different. Thinking through the consequences, or even the reasons why those words were in place in the first place.
Right.
And so David Atchison came in and said, hey, so why were those words there? And we like those words, so unless you have a good reason to change them, please don't change them. So it gives you time to go back and forth and think about it, and I think we do need more time.
And just in the interest of time, I'll try to keep this to 30 seconds, but I think overall this has been a great process. I actually really think that it's been good to engage the community and get different people's feedback, but we understand it's not a representative sample, but we do have some feedback. I think the question about the main floor and the owner living in the accessory, I think those are good things to consider, but it's something that's a particular issue there. But since it's being applied to wherever these accessories are, I think we need to be very careful about that. And I have talked with Mr. Atchison since you talked with him, and we're playing with some other creative ideas we might do. And I think there are some public feedback that I think when we go back to community, we can say, hey, they've asked this question, is there a reason why we need to do this? For example, we said the detached need to have separate utilities. And there was a reason why we did that. But if it was a permanent, up-to-code utilities, but not necessarily on a separate meter, would that still achieve what we intended it to do?
And we can take that maybe back to engineering.
Yeah, and we can take that back. Also, there was a request, we have this minimum of 1,200 square feet for the main unit. There are some units in Provo where they could have a detached, but the main one already is less than 12, so right now they're included. So some tweaks I think we can accommodate.
As I read that, even 10 minutes ago, I go, well, the intent of the 1,200 was that you not chop your house
Yes.
into something smaller on the main unit than 1,200.
Right.
It was never intended to limit the option of having a detached.
So if we will send this back to committee, I think we can clean all that stuff up and come back with a...
I just want to make that comment for our council candidates that are here. You have 135,000 constituents, you're not going to be able to keep everyone happy. And sometimes there's a tendency when you first start, take every single suggestion, say, I got to satisfy this person, you can't do that.
Yeah, I think in this case, we're dealing with an ordinance that has citywide impact. I mean, there is always that risk. But I think it's helpful to hear how this is the anticipated impacts on different neighborhoods so that we can make some of these tweaks. So I think that's as a member of the committee, I would love for us to just iron out a few more things. I don't think it'll end up being substantially different.
Just a few things, because it is a great ordinance the way you've written it. And I just want to make that point that you got to be careful. Because, again, there are some of those comments were completely opposite. You're making one person happy with you changing, and another person, I just was doing that.
If I could just mention real quickly, one of the other, or a real benefit of this ordinance is that it implements the licensing requirement, which should give us a lot better checks. We did with Mr. Paul Evans of the Pleasant View neighborhood. He had us check some units. They did that, went through them, and they found out there weren't that many problems. That it really involved health safety issues, perhaps enlarging a window or doing some other things, but it wasn't an onerous requirement to the homeowners or to the landlords.
I think just to follow up on that, the concern from a lot of neighborhoods is that enforcement in Provo is pretty lousy overall. I think it's getting better, and we've worked hard to make it better. And I think the RDL requirement, even if it's not technically an enforcement issue, it's actually, I think we have already evidence that it inspires compliance. Voluntary compliance is maybe better than enforcement anyway, right?
Mr. Ravier?
Just a little question on the setback requirement of 10 feet. Is that side and back, or is it? Okay, so that would maybe have a little stricter requirement than the main home. Is that correct?
Well, if you're building a new house, I think it's similar.
Yeah,
Right, Brian?
well, the accessory buildings, a garage can normally be up to within 3 feet of the property line. So this pushes it back if you've got an accessory unit in the garage, for instance. For a home, normally you have a 20-foot setback in the rear, so this would allow that.
I'm probably talking about the side more than anything.
Oh, okay. So the side,
So oftentimes, I mean, they've been 6, 8.
it's the same as for the main home, but it's more than would be required for normal accessory building, for an unoccupied accessory building.
So a home was built in the 60s, or 70s, where a 6-foot setback was required. And the accessory apartment matched the same.
There isn't a provision for that. They would have to meet the 10-foot.
Well, we have it already on this one. Say, look, our main house is close to whatever,
Yeah.
move this one over forward.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
And I believe it was brought up, Mr. Evans brought that up, I think, on variances, which would be that somebody could apply for variance to request that. Should it just be, that's one
Could the
alternative.
definition say not less than or the same as the main or something?
Not less than the main.
Something like that.
I put down the note on here, and that's something, I think that's a great thing for the committee to revisit with community development and look around.
That does match today's standard, but a lot of them are not going to be today's standard.
There are a lot of lots in my neck of the city that are very deep, and are not well used, and I think a detached accessory might be a great use for that land, but because they're so narrow, that 10-foot setback might include a lot of them, so that might be a good consideration to consider. Mr. Stewart?
I think the fact that you're including RDL, long overdue, and our biggest concern is health and safety of the community. That's what we're mandated to do. So I think that's just a wonderful part of this. I think in the long term, it will prove to be the best part of what you've done.
Any comments on that, Brian?
I don't think so. I'm just trying to take notes of some of those issues for when the committee goes back.
Right. So I like the robust process, and some people are a little late to the party. When I called and talked to some of them, they're like, oh yeah, well, I do have a question or concern, but they hadn't really focused on it, and so I thought giving them that opportunity would be a good thing.
You want to, I guess I could ask, is there a motion to?
I would move that we send this back to committee for further work.
Which committee?
To the housing committee.
Excellent. So, any discussion on that motion? Mr. Strachan?
Is the housing committee free then to send it back to the September 10th meeting if they have a chance to go through it and are satisfied with it under this motion?
I think that may be a question for legal, whether we have to cycle it through planning commission. But that's something that I think we can perhaps answer as we meet as a committee.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got three, a couple options. One would be to specifically authorize that in the motion. Two, even if it's not specifically authorized, leadership obviously always has the ability to reschedule it if they feel like it's ready. So far, I don't think the things I'm hearing don't sound to me like they need to go back to planning commission, because they are either reverting to what it already was or rejecting specific components of planning commission recommendations, which you always have the ability to reject a recommendation. So until we're adding something brand new, I think we're okay. But it may depend on the details of what we talk about in the committee.
So that would be the housing segment.
Let's talk about that. I mean, I think that might be something maybe one gets together first and then passes it by the other.
Okay. First and second.
Any other discussion? Can't see none, I'll call for a vote. All in favor? It is unanimous. Mr. Sewell excused. Unless there's objection, we will move to item 9, which is a discussion regarding a proposed parking permit program on Slate Canyon Drive. This will be presented by Ms. Hannah Peterson, Vice Chair of the Provost Neighborhood, along with Richard Holmes, Chair of the Provost Neighborhood, and Vicki Connect, Chair of the Provost South Neighborhood. This is budgeted for 30 minutes.
Richard Holmes, neighborhood chair, Provost neighborhood. Hannah is our vice chair, and then Mary is Provost South. Vicki. Mary's the other one. We have great neighborhoods. We have some problems. We have a lot of investor-owned property, and some of it is taken care of well, and a lot of it is not. And about 2 years ago, I guess, started to get a lot of complaints from neighbors about certain properties, that they weren't cared for, or it seemed like there were a lot more people there than should be living there, that there were cars parked on the streets and on the lawns, and is there something we can do about that? And so we did a kind of a survey. Hannah did, and she can tell you about that, but to look at who owns the property, how many investor properties do we have, how many are in compliance with the city ordinance, and how many are not. And we found out in our most neighborhoods, we had about 400 properties that were out of compliance. And in talking with community development, asking them to enforce on zoning laws, they expressed that they didn't have the resources really to do that, that it would take 6 full-time zoning officers, probably a year, and suggested that we consider implementing a parking program. And so we began holding meetings in the neighborhood throughout all areas of the neighborhood. We had a good response. We didn't know really when we started what kind of support we would have for that, and which is why we wanted to hold the meetings. And some areas we found more support than others, and Hannah will talk about that. We did get response from a lot of people, written response and suggestions, and so I'd like to share those with you. So, get back to you.
And if you're not familiar with where Provost and Provo South is, I'm hoping you all know where we're at. Our most noticeable landmark is Slate Canyon. We're the neighborhood right at the base of Slate Canyon, which is my favorite canyon. And the Slate Canyon Drive starts right there at about 3rd South. There's a roundabout, and then it's our longest north-south corridor in that part of town. It's very similar to Foothills Drive. So you've got this long north-south corridor, and then we have right here, I guess if you can see right here, that is the new street that's leading up to the Slate Canyon trailhead. So that's kind of just where we're situated. This, like Richard mentioned before, it's important to know that it was initiated by the residents. So it was by resident request that we look into parking regulation and also community development. We did identify over 400 non-conforming rentals, which Richard said, and we do have that information if we need to go ahead and share that. One of the main interesting things about Slate Canyon Drive, and this was a map that a resident put together, is just, it's a little unique. Slate Canyon Drive has a lot of residences right here that front Slate Canyon Drive. They were built very close together, so some of them have very small front yards, and some of them don't even have enough of a front yard to even put one car. So they're squished kind of close together. But right up against the mountain behind that are 3 HOA condo developments that were put in. They were designed for low-income housing. They were all built with only each unit only has enough for 2 cars. The driveways are usually only about 5 feet long, maybe just a few feet long, so there's no, to make a long story short, there's only enough room for 2 cars per unit. And when we went through and looked at the property records, and we utilized the county property records, and we did a lot of research, and it was a monumental task. But we found that in some of these areas we had well over 80% investor-owned properties, and almost all of them were not compliant. So, some of them were only renting to 3 people, but they still were bringing in 3 cars. Some of them 4 cars. So almost across the board, they were not compliant with the amount of vehicles. And our concern is that's just all, where else are they going to park? They were all coming down and parking on Slate Canyon Drive. So that's kind of where this has been a hot spot, just because of the nature of how it was built out. Those are just some of the streets just taken yesterday of some of the parking problems. If you drive up at night on Slate Canyon Drive, it's solid cars. There's not a single space for any car to be in. It's so overcrowded that people are even blocking in their driveways. That's regular. Parking on lawns, and then they're parking all the way up to the trail entrance of Slate Canyon Drive now too. This is our parking permit thing. So what we did is, community development did tell us to go ahead and do this. We held a series, so we passed out over 900 flyers to every door, and this is our flyer that we sent out. We decided to hold a series of 8 meetings so that we could hit as many people as possible, and we did it in residents' homes throughout the different areas of the community, just because a lot of people weren't attending our school, the meetings that we held at the school. And out of anything that happened, I thought this was one of the most successful things that we did. We had a lot of people who might have initially been frustrated about parking permits, but when they were meeting in neighbors' houses, and everybody got together and started talking about people, I felt like it was a really positive experience. People still had different opinions, but it was good. And the first meeting was at my house. I had well over 60 people crammed in. At 200 people, we just stopped counting. But we had a tremendous feedback, and we asked everybody to send in comment cards, and this is all of our data that we've kept. And so that's how we collected the information to more fine-tune this parking permit program. It was through that. Our main goal was we were trying to get as much resident opinion as possible and then craft the program according to what residents kind of wanted. We were also trying to heavily reduce parking congestion. The third thing, we were trying to reduce the need for zoning enforcement, and that's just been a hot spot in our neighborhood because we have so many non-compliant rentals still. Even after the ordinance went through, it's a really heavy burden on the neighborhood, and it's almost not, the zoning office has not to date, no matter how many times we've turned this in, even come close to being able to help us do this. So we're also trying to promote peace in the neighborhood, just where we can have a neighborhood with a compromise. We don't want to turn in all the zoning, but if people can at least park in front of their own house, that's really where we're at this point in time. And then the fifth thing, and it came up a lot in our meetings, was a desire to preserve Slate Canyon Drive and the canyon area for the entire community. That even though not everybody lives on Slate Canyon Drive, that is there's a lot of ownership for that canyon in our neighborhood, and there's a lot of frustration that it's now just becoming an overflow parking lot for the condos and for these out-of-state landlords. That's an area that we have planned to have parks, and there's a mountain bike course going in place and a disc golf course and all this going on, and to have it just be so crowded and congested that it's difficult to even ride your bike up there sometimes is a major concern for the community, that we would like to have Slate Canyon preserved just like Rock Canyon is preserved. And this is, I guess I don't need to say that, but this is, for example, that's some of the proposed park proposals that we're having in Slate Canyon Drive. This right here is the street leading up to the existing park that we have right now. This right here does not show on the map, but this is the new condo area, Aspen Summit, that's just been built out. And so all of and these are the houses, so this is all now overflow parking for the condo that's gone in. And then, like you said, this is taken from right up there on Slate Canyon, the trailhead. It still hasn't even already been built out. We're expecting that the increase in cars is only just going to increase as this condo area continues to be built out. So that is our proposed parking permit program. And like I said, we know that staff is going to tweak a few things, but this was basically the best, what we came together as a neighborhood, which was they did not want to do it in the larger single-family homes south. They wanted to start off with just Slate Canyon Drive. They wanted just a nighttime parking permit only from 1 a.m. to 6 a.m. The cost of the permit was $15 per permit, and they would have 6 single visitor passes and 1 7-day visitor pass. All properties on Slate Canyon Drive would qualify for at least one parking permit. And the reason being is, like I said before, there are some houses up there that would never even qualify for a single parking permit because they live on a cul-de-sac, or some of them have a fire hydrant, or some of them are just so close together that they would not even meet that criteria. And so that was a compromise to say everybody at least gets one. There is a little bit of buffer space as you head north on Slate Canyon Drive before you get to the trailhead that can accommodate some of those cars. And then there's probably only 3 or 4 homes that do have 36 feet of frontage, but the few homes that do, they would be allowed to buy a second parking permit if they could. This is one thing that we did request, and we did talk to staff about this before we did it. It's new, but we are requesting that all of the rental properties that apply for a parking permit have a current rental dwelling license, and that they must be compliant with the rental dwelling license before they are granted a parking permit. And that is something, like I said, we just are hoping that staff will look at it. We had a situation when we first looked at all of the properties in our neighborhood. We filed a grandma request, and is that what it's called? Mm-hmm. And we asked to see how many of all of these rental properties had a rental dwelling license. We did that in April of last year, right before zoning sent out the letter for the new rental dwelling license. Because we asked Carrie Walls, well, how are you going to inform everybody about the rental dwelling license? And she said, well, we'll send letters out to everybody we'll send letters to everybody who has a rental dwelling license. Well, we pulled up our information and then we compared it to everyone who had an RDL, and it was less than 5%. That's how many people actually had their RDL. And that's one of the concerns we have. We know that getting their rental dwelling license, a lot of people will become compliant, but how, with such high turnover, how do you even ever ask people or educate people on how to get their rental dwelling license? It's something that doesn't get done. And so what we're saying is we put in kind of a fail-safe here that if anyone goes to apply for their parking permit, wait a second, they realize that they have to get their rental dwelling license. So that's what we were requesting.
I mentioned, Hannah, the percentage of support on Slate Canyon Drive.
Oh, yes.
That as well.
Let me go through the results.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Well, we had, like I said, we had over 200 residents. Overall in the Provost neighborhood, we had about 50% who supported park regulation, 16% said they would consider it in the future, and 34% opposed it. And these are the different areas. Like I said, the areas obviously that had the highest amount of zoning problems, those were the people who supported it the most. On Slate Canyon Drive, we had over 70% supporting the parking regulation. And so that's how we felt that we had enough information and we had done our due diligence to kind of move this forward, bring it to you and see if it now can go to staff and move forward, because that's the area where we had the largest percentage of support. Vicki. Yeah, she is. The Slate Canyon Drive is split right down the middle between two different neighborhoods, and so we're always having to kind of work together on this because we share this long street. But she has some good information from residents.
I just have some pictures. Unfortunately, I'm not a PowerPoint person. So I have some pictures and letters from people that if you could pass those around and just have a look at it and show you some of the abuse that is going on with these. And I can't tell you how grateful I am for Hannah. She has really put 110% behind finding out statistics and doing all this. Today I took some pictures of just trailers. We all know that trailers are not supposed to park on the street. And yet we have a perpetual problem with people. I know of at least some of these are on the street 365 days in a year. And as far as I know, they've never been ticketed. They've never got a warning or a ticket and that. So these are some of the things, and I've marked where they're on Slate Canyon and some are on 16, what is the street? I wrote it on there. Anyway, and then this is Candace's letter that you received today, or last night if you were up to see that. So I know that you all have that. This is also Mike Morris's letter. I had requested that he send that to you because he is so frustrated, and so is Kimberly. Just another letter and pictures and things to go along with it. But one of the things that's so frustrating with this is that it's not just the rentals. Regular resident people are also part of the problem. I'm not blaming it all on rentals, but we do see when we have rentals this high that most of it is actually going out of state. They're not Provo people that have owned these, so there goes the money that we would hope enrich Provo. And so we'd like to see this changed, and it has changed. There on Slate Canyon, since the ordinance was passed as far as imposing fines and misdemeanors and so forth, it went from 48% down to 36%, is now 36% rental on Slate Canyon. And one of the things that really concerns me is Aspen Summit, that we have so many people parking on Slate Canyon that they're not really even, none of them have actual frontage. Some of them have backyards.
there against Lake Canyon. But Steve Stewart promised us that there would be guarantees that this would not go rental. And now it's up above like 50%. How much is it, you know?
Well, last year when we counted Aspen Summit, they're still building it out. They were at 64%. Canyon Meadows was at 92%, and Alpine Summit was at, I think it was around 80% rental.
And Deer Haven, which isn't on Slate Canyon, would dearly love to see something happen there, but we will wait on that one until we can get Slate Canyon moving. Deer Haven was the 80%, wasn't it? Is that what you just told me? I can't remember. Anyway, there's so many statistics to pass around. It's hard to remember what's what, especially with the foggy mind like I have today. So thank you for listening, and thank you for your help. Yes.
I just wanted to say one more thing. If it does go through and we do this, one of our concerns just to consider is what our alternative is if we don't get a parking permit. Because I think that's really important to consider is what's our alternative here. And I do have some concern about using zoning enforcement, heavy zoning enforcement as an alternate tool. Number one, I don't think it's going to be extremely expensive and difficult. It's going to cause a lot of hurt feelings and frustration in the neighborhood. This parking permit will do the same, but I don't think it will do the same as heavy zoning enforcement. I also think the parking permit will be more of a long-term solution for the neighborhood. I'm also concerned because those condo areas that you are seeing are almost predominantly occupied by the young single adult population in our neighborhood. And we are not here to kick out the young single adult population at all. We just need to have some type of compromise where the residents on that street can find some parking, and hopefully the condo areas and some of those owners can find a responsible place to park. And so I'm throwing that out there for our intent. Our intent is not to squish the neighborhood or hurt the neighborhood. Our intent is we're desperately trying to find a compromise that can benefit everybody and just take some of the burden off the neighborhood. And so I'll leave it at that.
You mentioned that it would be hard for people in those units to get rental license because of the turnover. The ownership doesn't turn over.
Yes.
The rentals might, so the ownership can know. They know they're supposed to have rental licenses.
Well, this is interesting. We did all the legwork a little bit for community development. We went through and found out who all the owners were. We got all of their addresses. We sent that over to community development. And like she said, we have about 20% of them went and got their RDLs, but we still have such a huge percentage that is ignoring that letter that came out for the...
It's not the renters, it's the owners.
It's the owners, and that's our only frustration is the owners. We're just asking these owners to be compliant and to take some form of responsibility for their parking, finding a space for their tenants.
I think your addition to the thing, they have to have a rental license in order to get a parking permit was genius.
Well, thank you. We're really hoping it works out because it's going to take a lot of...
Because once you give them a license to park when they're not licensed to rent.
Well, when we talked to Gary about it, because I went through and did it, it only took me about 5 minutes to locate that information to determine if something was owner occupied or not. Compare that with having to have a homeowner call zoning, send out an officer, knock on the door, confirm if it's owner occupied or not. The amount of time and effort it saves is just, it's huge.
Thank you all.
Question, I know a question for you probably. I totally understand the problem. I drive up there more regularly than my daughter and her husband bought a house, so just on the corner of Slate Canyon. So I'm up there more, it's near that. But my question is, if there aren't parking places, and I mean, what happens? We give a parking permit to people on Slate Canyon Drive, which rightfully they will have parking in front of the house. I understand. But if then those who are parking there, who live in maybe the condos, the townhouses, that are not parking, what's the solution? What's a compromise? What do we do with that?
I have some ideas.
Well,
So part of this goes back to when Hal Miller was on the council, and there was an enforcement effort, and there was a request to not enforce. And all of these projects were built to a certain standard. They were built as affordable family housing, and when you do it that way, you provide the amount of parking that a typical family needs, which is 2. Now, I don't know if I think they have changed that in some circumstances to 3 now, but the two off-street spaces is what some of these have, and some do have more, and some of them have a little bit bigger driveway, might be able to accommodate that, depending on which subdivision. But I guess the problem with the enforcement a couple of years ago was there was more than 3 singles living in these units, and even with 3 singles and 3 cars, then you already maybe have a problem. But if you exceed the 3, you certainly have a problem. And so we have over-occupancy contributing, and then we have the underlying rule that we've had for over 50 years, that if you have cars, you have to have an off-street spot for it. And so what we are dealing with here is something that was built for one purpose being used for another purpose. It's being rented out room by room. And, it could be Airbnb doing that, but in this case, it's a group of good people. Elizabeth can attest to that. And they like living where they're living. And that's the dilemma. It's like if you enforce, then it breaks up or hurts whoever gets enforced on. And Gary McGinn in the past has said, enforcement, proving how many people live in a particular place is just so difficult for us and painful for everyone. This is just do a parking permit program. And then everyone has to abide by the amount of parking that they've got.
But if I'm understanding your question correctly, though, I guess is there enough? Are there enough parking spots in those HOAs that if everyone is complying, everything's fine?
Yes. If they choose to comply with their zoning and what the law is right now, there is ample.
So the parking permit wouldn't put someone in a position where they can't actually get a spot?
No. No, the only reason why is if they're non-compliant. So I guess that's really what we're saying is if you're not compliant, then either one of these.
When you say you're not compliant, we're talking about occupancy. We're talking about 4 and 5 people in a house instead of 2 or 3. So the problem seems like it's occupancy and enforcement has caused the parking problem.
Yes.
So we're going to maybe help solve the parking problem down here on Slate Canyon Drive, but the bigger problem is not.
And that really is where, and that's how we started though. We started out with saying, you've got a huge occupancy problem. You have all of these, landlords who are breaking the law. But when we took that information to the zoning department, what we got was, we know that's how it is, but you can't rely on zoning enforcement to realistically take care of this issue. And while that's frustrating, to hear that, a lot of residents were frustrated. They felt like now we're being penalized because a group of people aren't, being honest, or now we have to pay $15 a month, and go through this because people aren't being honest, or because the city can't enforce zoning. We were at a point where, but what is our other option? And we have already given all of this information to the zoning department. We've spent years trying to do it, and now we're trying to find another solution because for us, zoning enforcement has not worked in that neighborhood because of how extensive it is.
We even have one fellow that rents, and there's like 6 people there that rent in the same house on Slate Canyon Drive. He has 9 cars. He has 9 Mercedes-Benz that he parks around Slate Canyon. And so it just, this is really the best way to try and get that under control.
We didn't want to. I didn't want to do a parking permit either. I wanted just to go with zoning enforcement and try and do something like that. But I guess what it is we're trying to follow staff's recommendation, and we're trying to find something that will work and bring some amount of compromise.
You said $15 per month? Is that
Oh, sorry, it's per year, it's $15 per year.
And I think the idea is if you enforce parking, then you don't have to enforce occupancy. Occupancy will kind of take care of itself as people decide either if I can't park here, I'm going to find another place to live, or work out some other solution. But I think the thought is by enforcing parking, it's a secondary way to, perhaps more effective way to enforce.
You'll solve the problem, it will help it.
Encourage
I
compliance.
completely support it. I think the only thing that is likely to happen is that the guy with the 9 Mercedes and all those other trailers are going to show up somewhere else. And that's what happened in the Seven Peaks area. They put the parking permit there, and then all of a sudden all these cars started just showing up 24/7 on Locust, because there wasn't anything there. So people just find a place in the city where they can park, and they're not. Anyway, that's not your problem.
Well,
if you solve the problem.
consider that, and we wondered about the feasibility of doing the parking program in the whole neighborhood. But as we talked with residents in different parts of the neighborhood, we decided that the support was high, so it was let's start there. If the problem moves
You'll see
farther
us in
down,
a
then we
month.
can deal with that then on those streets as well. We'll just take it street by street.
We are over time, so we will have an opportunity to discuss this later. We'll have an opportunity to discuss this later in the council meeting.
Jay Leno's, like, 9 Mercedes.
All right, we have one final item. How much of the closed meeting, how much time do we need for the closed meeting? Can you give us an estimate?
I think there's been one request by the council for the purpose of a meeting and appointee, so I think generally that takes like 5 minutes. But you know when they're going to be here?
I thought it was
That's
one-
not what it's for.
Oh, that's not what it's for.
No.
Okay.
I believe it's a real estate redevelopment.
All right, so we will jump into this item and try to keep it 10 minutes or so.
We'll nix that whole,
So no closed meeting. Okay, excellent. Let's see if we can get this done in 15 minutes. Sorry, let me just read it in. This is a discussion regarding an update on council priority issues, but if I could just introduce it maybe for 30 seconds. Basically, we had some New Year's resolutions, things that we wanted to get done. We are now pretty much 3/4 of the way through the year, and so I figured it was probably past time for an update and just kind of take a look at what we've accomplished, what progress we've made, and possibly even a discussion on what we think we can get done before the end of the year, and maybe prioritize, maybe drop some things so we can focus on others.
forgive me if I didn't spend much time, I didn't spend any time on this chart, but putting what's been accomplished. It's just a recognition. Back in early July, we talked about the idea that we only had half a year left, and what are the priorities that you as council members think that we could get done, and so we came up with this list, and I just wanted to, 2 months later, give you a sense of where we are on things and when we think that they might be coming forward, and kind of see where you want to go with it. So that's kind of where the focus has been for now. We just had a good discussion on the A&S overlays. I understand that we're going to send that back to the Housing Committee first, and so we're going to try and move that up to as early as next week. It was in conflict on September 10th, so if you'd like, we're going to check availability, see if we can have like the 4th of September or something to get that going. Parking programs. It's been a number of fronts that you've been dealing with this. The permit parking application process, there was a bit of work done on it in July. It's on the agenda tonight for your approval. So hopefully we'll give you an update on this a month or two from now that this item will be gone. Joaquin Parking Program is in the process of the committee's drafting a program to include permit and paid on-street parking. We need to determine how to allocate and distribute permits, how to increase the availability of parking, and if everything goes well, I could see it being on the agenda for the full council in October. work meeting. Downtown parking policy might actually be a little bit later in October, but there's progress being made there, but it's still very early. Basically, the committee is researching possible management options and for garages and on-street parking. So we're kind of in that early phase where we're still asking questions and having presentations. So that group is moving forward. Zoning compliance, let's start at the very bottom for just a minute. The signs, the direction was to amend the code regarding electronic signs. We've been talking about a number of issues, everything from buffering to churn to size. We're at the point where we're drafting a rough report for review and bring that back. And I do see a possibility that unless something else comes up, that could come back to as early as September for some discussion. Over occupancy, we're having a meeting with Kerry Walls and Marcus Draper tomorrow to talk about what their request is to have the council make over occupancy a public nuisance and put that in that part of the code. So the intent is to put that together, circulate that to you, and see if that's something you will want to go. And it could be as early as September 10th.
If I could just mention, when I first heard that, I thought like this was an escalation. Like, oh, we're bumping it up to make it easier to enforce. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Jones can mischaracterize this, but what it does is instead of only pursuing it through kind of criminal, you can do things through civil. And so it doesn't necessarily make it worse, it just gives another avenue in which to, and there's some advantages to that other avenue.
That's correct. It provides, it's just another tool for pursuing the same thing. Pursuing it in a different type of court changes the standard of proof that's necessary. Also may be easier to successfully address ongoing problems because you can get a court injunction ordering the behavior to cease rather than just having a criminal action against one person. So that it's just another tool that some other cities have used.
So you may recall that about a year and a half ago now, or maybe it was just a year ago, but the rental dwelling license / disclosure discussion of the council came out of the zoning committee's work in the 9-point strategic plan to try and improve compliance with zoning regulations. And after that was adopted and implemented, to use Cameron Beal's phrase, kind of the air was sucked out of the room in terms of moving forward with some of the zoning issues. One that's been out there for a long time is the issue of short-term rentals. And there is a product out there that will help you track where short-term rentals are and in terms of regulation of them. And there are about 7 or 9 zones, as I recall, that short-term rentals are allowed. Really the question that I think the council may wish to determine is whether to take the zoning committee's recommendation to have some kind of short-term rental regulation, and if you want to take that on. Now, there's a number of issues to consider. Let me just give you, read through a bit of a list. Does the city allow STRs in all zones or just certain zones? Are you allowing them as a whole home or a home share? In other words, room rentals. Are all types of homes or just certain ones? Owner must be in the home and hosting or not? Owner must live in the home for a certain number of days. Can a tenant be a host? Number of allowable adult occupants. What's the minimum maximum length of time for stays? Should there be a certain number of days between guests? Parking issues. What type of forms, applications, floor plans, parking plans, licenses, fees, taxes? I mean, obviously, if you regulate it, you should be collecting some revenue from it because essentially they're acting as hotels. And then how do you enforce violations? So one of the questions really for us as staff is, does the council have an appetite and a desire to do some work on this, or do we leave it with the status quo, which I don't think, at least the past councils haven't been satisfied where that is, but do you have an appetite for trying to do some work on this
between now and the end of the year.
I think long-term rental ordinance is the biggest issue. And somehow we can work on that, or continue to work on that. It seems to me it's more important. Yes, because this is pretty complex. Probably would be best to start with the new council, but four of us would have October, November, and really don't do much in December.
There's seven meetings left, yeah.
Well spent, except maybe preparing for the next council.
Right. So, I do believe it'll be a growing problem and something that we need to be concerned about. But if I had a choice between spending, let's say, $10,000 to do data scraping and $10,000 to hire one or two, increase our zoning officers, that would be an interesting question to put before Carrie. And I do ask Carrie, I went down to her office, I said, what do you need? Where do we go next? And it was like, well, okay, public nuisance is on the list. We need to get that done. And we didn't get funded. She did want money for the data scraping. But then, as a policy question, if we feel like we maybe need more zoning officers, then I would approach her and say, okay, if you had a choice, which way would you go?
I don't think we have too much time for discussing all of this, but one thought on this is when we were having meetings about the data scraping for short-term rentals, the question was asked, could this also be used to track advertisements for regular rentals? And that might be a good nexus there where we might appropriate funds now so we can start collecting the data, but then also use it as a tool to find, if we were down at 5% RDL compliance, and I think that we've got some things that are improving that, but if we had something that, every 6 months this unit is being advertised, or maybe it's every 2 years or whatever, that we get these advertisements for long-term rentals, if we could capture that and compare it against our RDLs, that might be a way long-term to improve compliance.
Since there was benefits to that, I think technology, if it would help us, it would be well implemented.
I was going to say essentially the same thing. I think we can't get to all those fine-grained policy questions until we know how big of a problem it is. And we think we know a little bit, but we really won't know the details until we appropriate some funds for the software. So it seems to me, if we can get the software and it gives us the data that we want, this is probably not going to get us to, we're not going to get all that done before December, but at the very least, this council could probably decide to appropriate the funds for the software, and in the meantime, Carrie can, we can determine who we're going to license for that, and then down the road, the next council gets the data, and we can start looking at some policy questions.
I totally agree with that. Now that you bring it up, if we can use this as a way to gather more information than just the short-term rentals, but also the long-term rentals. We're looking at doing a citywide housing audit, understanding our housing better, and obviously we're having a disconnect if in some areas 90% of the people don't have a rental dwelling license, and so when we do our census information, do we know for sure how many units are rented versus owner-occupied? And so there's this huge disconnect between those that have licenses and the reality.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chapman.
So what I'm hearing then is there's some interest in the work long-term, but not in the immediate future. What I would suggest is that we reconvene the zoning committee, though, as we move into the fall and start work on this as a project, but not with the expectation of trying to get it done by December.
But I think we could get done buying their software.
Yeah, and we would need to appropriate about $20,000. And one suggestion I had, and I haven't had a discussion with the mayor, or with Wayne, or John Borgett yet, and that is, with the year end, the city, anticipating the city will have some surplus funds, and whether or not we can pull it as a one-time expense from the carryover. And that's a question for the administration.
I like the idea of just having that as our goal. Yeah, so getting at least to the point where we've decided on the software and we've appropriated the funds for it would be reasonable.
Okay, so we'll move forward in that direction and we'll have some more conversations. But let me go on to the rest of this. So we've been working on inclusionary zoning. There's a lot of meat there to be had, and we're trying to make some, start crafting some policy statements on them for you to consider. But we're also trying to fully understand the range of inclusionary zoning policies that you might consider. So it's probably one of the bigger items that we're working on right now. Some simple things would be like one policy area could be impact fee exemptions for owner-occupied affordable housing projects. Down payment assistance programs, we looked at that as a possibility. You know, what if we use something like this internally as a tool to help recruit first responders as the city tries to fill vacancies. And then do some promotion of programs that aren't necessarily ours, but they exist. Things like the Community Heroes, Good Neighbors, Teacher Next Doors programs, which help provide down payment assistance for these groups, first responders, teachers, etc. Stuff like that. And then one of them that comes out of the inclusionary zoning would be, as we talked about trying to have affordable housing within various projects, and we had that conversation about the mix a while back, and how much affordable housing in there. And one of the questions comes up, because it was mentioned, was what if they paid money to, say, a land trust or something, and to promote affordable housing somewhere, rather than putting it into a project. And so we would need to put in our city policies somehow a payment in lieu consideration for affordable housing, to find what that looks like and how to target that and what is the cost. And that leads us to this issue of community land trust. Who's going to be our partners if we don't want to administer the money ourselves directly? And we had talked about one point about creating our own community land trust, and then we learned that Provo City Housing went and did one on a county-wide basis. So there's a lot of policy areas there to consider. There is an RFI out there. It's due at the end of the month, and we're expecting that Provo City Housing Authority and NeighborWorks are going to partner in response to that. I haven't been able to reach Robert Byrne and find out where they're at on that, since I got back from England. But anyway, we're making progress. October might still be a little bit early. It might be right on track for having some of this come to you at a work session. So those are some of the things that we're making progress on. Foothills protection, the grading, the Planning Commission is reviewing the grading proposal tomorrow, and hopefully they'll give you a positive recommendation, and we can bring that to council next month for your consideration. And then the committee, the Foothills Protection Committee, is also looking at broader foothills protection policy. They've been looking at the sensitive lands ordinance, some of the development standards, etc. And depending on where they're at, I'm looking at George because he's chairing that, but it's possible we could be coming back in mid-fall with some more recommendations for the council to consider. And that's all I had on there.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Sharkey. Any thoughts as we near the finish line?
Yeah, one thing that wasn't necessarily up there is we were working in the neighborhood program and having a meeting downtown, which is happening this week, isn't it?
Yeah.
Finally, having a meeting downtown to elect a co-chair to represent the residents and work with Quinn, yeah. Mr. Peterson, yeah. And that's so we've noticed all the big complexes like City View and Startup Crossing, and just want to get out the residents and get that show on the road, because it's just going to be more and more people living downtown.
There's a number of things that are happening that aren't necessarily full policy related, so I tried to focus on what needs to come back to you for an ordinance change or some kind of proposal. So.
All right, thank you. Any thoughts before we close? If there's no objections, I will declare this meeting adjourned.
something from the